Hey, welcome back. I'm glad you're here tonight. If you're new to this little corner of the internet, welcome. This is the place where we slow everything down and let history tell its stranger, quieter stories. And if you've been here before, you already know the drill. Get settled, get comfortable. Tonight's story is going to stay with you a while. In the year 1846, inside one hospital in Vienna, there were two doors side by side leading into two rooms that looked almost the same. Same beds, same white sheets, same soft cries of newborns down the hall. But walk through the wrong door to give birth, and your chances of walking back out again dropped by almost 10 times. And for years, no doctor in that building could tell you why. Before we walk through either of those doors together, if the kind of story that sits quietly between history and heartbreak is something you enjoy, it would mean a lot if you tapped that like button right now. And if this is your first time here, stick around a while longer so you don't miss what comes next. I would love to know where in the world are you tonight, and what time is it right where you are. Drop it in the comments below. I look at every single one of them. And if something about tonight's story stays with you, tell me that too. Now let's get everything just right. Dim the lights if you can. Maybe turn on a fan or anything that hums low in the background, just enough sound to hold on to in the dark. Get comfortable because we're about to step into 1846. Vienna General Hospital was by the standards of its day one of the finest teaching hospitals in Europe. Grand stone corridors, physicians trained by the best minds on the continent. Mothers came here to give birth believing they were walking into the safest room in the city. Picture the hallway itself. Tall windows letting in thin grey light. The echo of footsteps on stone. Somewhere behind a heavy wooden door, the low murmur of medical students taking notes, and further down the soft, uneven sound of a newborn learning how to cry. For too many of them, that belief was wrong. The sickness had a name that sounded almost gentle. Childbed fever. It came on quietly a day or two after delivery. A fever. Then pain low in the body spreading. Then within days, for far too many women, it took everything. Mothers who had just held their newborn for the first time were gone before the child turned a week old. Picture it for a second. A young mother, still weak from delivery, finally getting to hold her baby against her chest for the very first time, with no idea that in that same room, that same week, other mothers just like her were already burning up with a fever that would not break. And here is the part that made no sense to anyone standing inside that hospital. There were two maternity wards right next to each other in the very same building. The first clinic staffed by physicians and medical students. The second clinic staffed entirely by midwives. In the first clinic, in some months, nearly 30 out of every 100 mothers died. In the second clinic just down the hall, that number was closer to 3. Word of this got around the city fast. Pregnant women began begging on their knees in the admissions hall not to be placed in the first clinic. Some, it's said, chose to deliver their babies out in the street, rather than risk that door at all, only coming inside once the birth was already over. Think about that for a moment. Women were safer giving birth on cold cobblestones than in a room full of trained physicians. Into this mystery walked a young doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis, 28 years old, Hungarian. Recently appointed as an assistant in the first clinic, the deadly one, under a senior physician named Professor Johann Klein. Semmelweis was by every account a little relentless, the kind of man who tracked everything, every death, every hour, every meal served on the ward. If Vienna General Hospital had a suggestion box, he would have filled it by himself. He could not let the mystery rest. He tested theory after theory, crossing them off one by one. Was it overcrowding? No, if anything, the midwives' ward was fuller since so many women tried to get in there instead. Was it how the women lay in bed during delivery, He had the doctors change position from lying flat onto their side. Nothing changed. Then he noticed something stranger. Every time a woman died in the first clinic, a priest walked the length of the ward to deliver last rites an attendant in front of him, ringing a small bell the whole way, passing bed after bed after bed on his way to the one at the very end. In the second clinic, the layout was different. A priest could reach a dying woman almost directly with no long bell-ringing walk past every other frightened mother in the room. Could fear itself be doing this? Semmelweis asked the priest to take a longer, quieter route instead, no bell at all, so the other women would never know death had just visited the room next to them. The deaths kept coming anyway. For months, every answer he crossed off led him back to nothing at all. Then, in the early spring of 1847, something happened that changed everything. A fellow physician he deeply trusted, a professor named Jakob Kolletschka, was helping students during an autopsy when one of them slipped. A scalpel meant for a body already gone cut into his finger instead. It was a small wound, almost nothing. Within days, Kolletschka was running a fever. Then came the pain spreading through his body. Then, only a short time later, he was dead. Semmelweis studied the notes from his friend's autopsy, and his hands went still. These signs inside Kolletschka's body were the same signs he had seen over and over in the bodies of the mothers who died of childbed fever, and that was when it hit him. Every morning before stepping into the maternity ward, the physicians and medical students of the first clinic came straight from the dissecting room. They had spent the early hours with their hands inside cadavers, learning anatomy the only way anyone knew how back then, and in 1846 almost nobody washed their hands before touching a living patient. In a stranger twist, some physicians of the era believed the smell that clung to their hands after a morning in the dissecting room was almost a badge of hard work. Proof they had done real work that day. The midwives, on the other hand, never set foot in the dissecting room. They came to their patients with hands that had touched nothing but soap and linen. Semmelweis came to a conclusion that felt to him almost too simple to be true. Something invisible was being carried on the hands of well-meaning doctors from the bodies of the dead straight to the bodies of new mothers. Nobody used the word germ yet. That understanding was still decades away. But Semmelweis did not need the word to be right. He gave a new order to every student and physician working under him. Before touching any patient, wash your hands not with plain water, but with a solution made from chlorinated lime. He chose it on purpose. Soap alone left a smell behind. This did not. If the smell was gone, he reasoned, then so was whatever was causing it. It must have felt to the students standing at that basin for the first time like a strange and almost insulting new rule. Scrub your hands every single time before you walk into that room, as if their own hands could be the danger. The numbers did not lie. Within months, deaths in the first clinic dropped from around 13 out of every 100 mothers down to nearly 2. The very same ward that had once terrified an entire city had almost overnight become just as safe as the one next door. You might expect that this news would have made Semmelweis a hero, a man who solved a medical mystery that had quietly killed thousands of mothers. Instead, it made him an enemy, because if Semmelweis was right, then every physician who had ever walked from the dissecting room to the delivery room without washing his hands had without meaning to been part of the reason a mother never got to raise her child. Nobody wanted to hear that, least of all the senior doctors whose entire careers had been built inside that hospital. Professor Klein turned against him. Colleagues mocked him when he wasn't in the room, and sometimes even when he was. In 1850, Semmelweis stood in front of the Vienna Medical Society and laid out everything he had found, hoping the numbers alone would be enough to convince them. They were not. By 1849, he had already been pushed out of the hospital that had given him his answer. Before long, he left Vienna behind and returned to Budapest, and there, quietly, without the crowd of Vienna watching, he kept doing the same thing. He introduced hand-washing in another hospital. Deaths dropped there too, but the rejection followed him. Year after year, he wrote long, increasingly desperate letters to physicians across Europe, some of them addressed to strangers, all carrying some version of the same plea. In one of them, he wrote words that still stop people cold today. "The killing must end, and to bring it to an end I shall stand guard." Nobody was listening, and slowly that weight began to break him. By 1865, those closest to Semmelweis had started to worry. His temper had changed. His letters had grown strange, almost frantic. During those final weeks while working near a body in a dissecting room, he suffered a small wound to his hand not unlike the one that had taken his friend Kolechka nearly 20 years before. Not long after, in a state that friends and family could no longer manage on their own, he was taken to an asylum. He never came out. Not long after, infection spread through his body and Ignaz Semmelweis died. He was 47 years old. Sit with that for a moment, because it is almost too strange to say out loud. The same man who spent nearly 20 years trying to warn the world about invisible danger passing from one body to another, died from that exact same invisible danger in the end. There's actually a term for what happened to him, one that outlived every doctor who ever mocked him in that hall. Psychologists call it the Semmelweis reflex, the very human habit of rejecting new evidence not because it's wrong, but because believing it would mean admitting we were the problem all along. You have probably felt a small version of that reflex yourself in an argument at work, maybe even at your own dinner table. Semmelweis just happened to feel it at a scale that cost thousands of lives. It took years, and the later work of scientists like Pasteur and Lister, proving to the world that Semmelweis had been right all along for anyone to fully understand what he had given them. In 1892, the Royal College of Physicians helped fund a monument in his honour built in Budapest, the city where he had quietly kept saving mothers even after Vienna turned its back on him. Today there's a small sign above almost every hospital sink in the world. Wash your hands. Most people walk past it without second thought. But somewhere behind that ordinary little sign is the story of a man who was right and alone and out of time all at once. A man who tried to hold a door shut against something the whole world refused to see, and paid for it with everything he had. And yet every single time someone in a hospital today rinses their hands before touching a patient in a very real way, they are finishing a sentence Ignaz Semmelweis was never given the chance to finish himself. And that thin, blurry line between the body still fighting to survive and the body that had already lost followed the people of that century everywhere they went. Not just into hospital corridors like the ones Semmelweis walked through every morning. It followed them home, into their bedrooms, into their gardens, into the very coffins waiting for them at the end of every life. Because if trained physicians standing right at the bedside could get that line wrong, then an entire generation started asking a question that would haunt them for the rest of the century. What if the mistake wasn't made in a hospital bed at all? What if it was made in a coffin already lowered into the ground? Somewhere in Germany, in a long, quiet building, most people crossed the street to avoid a nurse work the night shift. Except every single one of her patients had already been declared dead. She was not alone in that room. Around her, dozens of bodies rested on shallow beds dressed for burial, surrounded by fresh flowers, the sweet smell doing its best to cover something the flowers could never quite hide. And tied around one finger of every single body was a thin cord running up toward the ceiling connected to a small brass bell. Her entire job for hours at a time, night after night, was simply to sit and listen and wait for a bell that almost never rang. This was called a waiting mortuary, and by the later 1800s, cities across Germany had built dozens of them. Not because doctors expected most of the dead to wake up, because enough families were terrified that one of them might. Let's talk about that fear tonight, the one that followed almost every household through the 1800s, quietly into every sick room, every parlour, and eventually into the grave itself. Doctors even gave it a proper name: taphophobia, the fear of being buried alive. And here's the part that makes this whole story so much harder to laugh off. That fear was not entirely unreasonable. Think about what a doctor of that century actually had to work with. No electrocardiogram to catch a faint heartbeat, no machine that could measure brain activity. Just a hand pressed against a chest, an ear against a mouth, and a great deal of guesswork. Deep comas, drowning, certain fevers, even a fainting spell in a tightly laced corset, could all mimic death closely enough to fool a trained eye. In the Netherlands, one facility known simply as the Apparent Dead House kept attendants on hand around the clock holding a small mirror or a loose feather in front of every corpse's mouth, watching for the faintest cloud of fog, the slightest tremble, before anyone was allowed to sign the paperwork. Would you have trusted a mirror and a feather if that mirror and that feather stood between you and being buried alive? So in 1846, the Academy of Sciences in Paris did something almost touching in its seriousness. They opened a formal competition offering a prize to whoever could invent the most reliable test for actual death. The winner was a physician named Eugène Bouchou. His answer in the end was almost embarrassingly simple. Listen to the chest with a stethoscope. If there is no heartbeat for a full 2 minutes and later he stretched that window to 5, the person can be considered gone. You would think that settles it. It did not right away, and honestly, the other proposals submitted for that same prize tell you everything you need to know about how desperate people were for an answer. One doctor suggested sticking a long needle tipped with the tiny flag straight into the heart. If the flag waved, the heart was still beating underneath. Another insisted on pressing the finger of the apparently deceased into his own ear, certain he could feel what he called the buzz of life travelling through it. A third simply poured warm liquid into the mouth and watched closely for a swallow. I don't share those to poke fun at people who are in their own strange way trying their best. I share them because they prove something important. This was not blind Victorian superstition running wild with no science attached. This was serious credentialed medicine quietly admitting that the line between alive and gone was far blurrier than anyone was comfortable saying out loud. Once that admission was out in the open, popular culture did what popular culture always does. It ran with it. Edgar Allan Poe had already written a short story called The Premature Burial, one of the most unsettling pieces of his career, describing the exact sensation of waking up in a box 6 feet underground. In 1854, a Belgian painter named Antoine Wiertz unveiled a canvas showing a supposed cholera victim clawing her way back to life inside her own coffin. Newspapers loved the story even more than the painters did, and they printed account after account, some real most wildly exaggerated, of people supposedly found scratched and twisted inside their coffins after exhumation headlines dressed up with just enough grim detail to sell a few more copies at the newsstand the following morning. Whether every one of those newspaper stories was true almost doesn't matter. What matters is that an entire generation believed they could be true, and belief, especially the frightened kind, is usually enough to build a whole industry. And build one they did. The earliest attempt came from a German physician named Johann Gottfried Taberger, who in 1829 designed a simple system of cords tied to the hands, feet, and head of the deceased, each one running up to a bell mounted above the grave. If the body so much as twitched, the bell would ring, and a watchman stationed nearby would come running with a shovel. Picture trying to explain that purchase to a friend. A coffin fitted with its own bell. Would they have called you foolish or quietly wish they had thought of it first? Almost 40 years later, an American inventor named Franz Vester, working out of Newark, New Jersey, patented something far more elaborate. His design included a sealed tube running from the face of the coffin straight up to open air, along with a small ladder fixed to the inside wall and, yes, a bell. If you woke underground, you could either climb out under your own power or ring for help while breathing through the tube. Vesta was so confident in his invention that in the late summer of 1868 he had himself buried alive on purpose in front of a paying crowd at a brewery garden in Newark. Roughly 600 people showed up, each one handing over 50 cents for a ticket to watch a man climb willingly into a grave and an hour later climb back out of it to applause. Then near the very end of the century came the most theatrical version of them all. A Russian count named Michel de Karnis-Karnicki unveiled a coffin called Lekarnis, fitted with a spring-loaded mechanism that could detect the smallest movement of the chest. The instant it did, a flag would shoot up 4 feet above the grave, a light would switch on, and fresh air would flow down into the box. He demonstrated it in Paris to a room full of scientists and at least one volunteer. An Italian man remembered only by the name Lorenzo allowed himself to be sealed inside Lekarnis for 9 full days, just to prove it could keep a person alive that long if it had to. Between Vesta's first patent and the early 1920s, at least 22 different safety coffin designs were formally patented in the United States alone. 22 separate inventors, each one convinced they had solved a fear that money apparently could not stop people from paying to solve. Here's a small detail I've always found strange in a satisfying kind of way. You've probably heard the phrase "saved by the bell," and if you are anything like most people, you've probably heard it explained as coming from these very coffins, some poor soul ringing a bell to be rescued from an early grave. It is one of the most widely repeated pieces of trivia about this whole subject. It is also not true. That phrase actually comes from the boxing ring, from a fighter rescued by the bell marking the end of a round decades after most of these coffins had already gone out of fashion. I only mention it because it says something almost poetic about this entire chapter of history. The fear was so powerful it managed to attach itself to a saying it never actually created. Because here is the harder truth sitting underneath all of it. Across every design, every patent, every dramatic public burial demonstration, there is no verified case, not one of a single person actually rescued alive by a safety coffin. The bells did ring on occasion, almost always, because a body in the natural and unglamorous process of decomposition had shifted or swelled enough to pull the cord on its own. There is actually a grim little footnote historians still argue about today. When old cemeteries were relocated, workers would sometimes find a coffin lid scratched from the inside, or a body turned onto its side instead of flat on its back, and for over a century that image alone kept the fear alive. Most researchers who study this now point to something far less supernatural. Gases released during decomposition can shift a body-warp cheap wood, even loosen a jaw enough to look like a final silent scream. Unsettling without question, but not the same thing as someone waking up. So why did an entire continent keep building these things, spending real money on a solution, with as far as anyone can prove a success rate of exactly 0? I think the honest answer says less about Victorian gullibility and more about how humans have always handled fear. Nobody was doing the math on probability, they were doing the math on regret. If the odds of waking up buried alive were 1 in 100,000, that still left a number of real people somewhere in that position, and no family wanted to be the one who gambled and lost. Take another look at that waiting mortuary from the very start of tonight's story. The bodies did not simply lie there unattended. Each one rested in a shallow zinc tray filled with a mild antiseptic meant to slow the process of decay just enough to buy a few extra days of certainty, while the flowers stacked around every bed worked to hide what the antiseptic alone could not. Even here, money still mattered. The wealthiest families paid for their own private section tucked away from everybody else's dead. In the German region of Württemberg alone, roughly 1 million bodies passed through mortuaries exactly like this one between 1828 and 1849. Watched over, laid out under flowers wired to bells. Not one of them ever woke up. And yet the mortuaries kept their doors open for decades anyway. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment, and it is only my own reading of it, so take it for what it's worth. Almost every safety coffin, every waiting mortuary bed, every clever spring-loaded flag cost money most working families simply did not have. A labourer buried in a plain pine box got none of that protection bell or otherwise, no matter how afraid his family might have been. Fear of being buried alive turned out to be in its own quiet way a luxury. The rich got a bell to ring. Everyone else just had to hope, or more often they simply waited. You've probably heard of the old custom called a wake family and friends sitting up through the night beside a body before it was ever buried. A lot of people assume that tradition comes from exactly this fear, quite literally waiting to see if someone wakes. Most language historians will tell you that isn't really where the word comes from. But the custom itself, sitting up all night watching, holding off just one more day before letting go, was absolutely shaped by this same anxiety in households that could never have afforded a coffin with a bell wired to it at all. You did not need money for that kind of precaution. You only needed somebody willing to stay awake beside you. Call it a waste if you want, standing here with all the hindsight in the world on your side. But picture yourself in 1840 instead, with a fresh story in the paper every other week about somebody clawing at the inside of a coffin lid. Hindsight is exactly the one thing you would not have had. By the very end of the century, the fear had grown organised enough to form actual institutions. In 1896 in London, a formal society was founded with one single purpose: campaigning for stricter medical standards before any death certificate could be signed, and for a mandatory waiting period before any burial could legally take place. Members wrote to newspapers, petitioned Parliament, and collected hundreds of accounts from families who believed a loved one had been buried too soon. Most of those accounts could never be proven either way decades after the fact, with no body left to examine and no doctor left to question. But the campaign itself was taken seriously enough to be debated in medical journals of the day, which tells you this had already stopped being a fringe worry whispered over tea and become something much closer to a genuine cause. What had started as folklore whispered between frightened families had by then become a real public health movement, with its own meetings, its own pamphlets, and its own seat at the table in serious medical conversations. We like to imagine we've left all of this behind, and in most ways we have. Modern medicine can measure the electrical activity of a heart down to the smallest flicker, and pronounce death with a level of certainty no 1846 physician could have dreamed of. But every so often, doctors still study a much smaller, much rarer version of this same nightmare. A handful of surgical patients each year report a strange kind of awareness during anesthesia, aware for a few seconds of voices in the operating room unable to move a single muscle to tell anyone. It is not the coffin. It is not the bell. But it is the same fear wearing a slightly different coat. The fear of being alive inside a body that the world has already decided is finished. Maybe that is why this particular chapter of the past never quite fades the way other old fears do. It was never really about coffins at all. It was about control, about being unheard, about a voice with absolutely nowhere left to go. And if you have ever felt unheard in a room full of people, even for a moment, you already understand on some small scale exactly what kept an entire century awake at night. And that same anxious, watchful mood did not stay buried underground where it started. It followed people right back up into the world of the living, past the cemetery gates, past the flowers and the zinc trays, and the quiet nurse listening for a bell, and straight into their own bedrooms at night, where an entirely different invisible threat was waiting for them. One they were convinced could slip in through a half-open window while they slept and take them quietly before morning ever arrived. Picture a small town along a river somewhere in the American South sometime around 1850. As the sun drops low over the water, you can watch the same ritual repeat itself house after house. Mothers calling children in from the yard, wooden shutters swinging shut, every window in every home sealed tight before the last light disappears, and left that way until morning no matter how warm the night still felt. Nobody in that town thought they were being paranoid. They believed with complete confidence that the air itself turned dangerous after dark. Doctors of the era had a name for what they feared was drifting through an open window at night. Miasma, a poisoned vapour invisible rising off swamps marshland, and anything rotting in the heat said to travel through the dark and settle into a sleeping body through the nose and mouth. The idea was old, far older than anyone living in 1850. Centuries earlier, the Greek physician Hippocrates had already noticed that people living near stagnant standing water tended to fall ill with fevers more often than everyone else, and he was not wrong about the pattern. The Romans noticed the very same thing and actually drained marshland around their settlements because of it centuries before the word malaria even existed. Both civilizations were watching the correct pattern play out in front of them generation after generation. They were only ever wrong about what exactly was doing the harm, and there is a small detail here I find almost too fitting to be true. One of the diseases everyone blamed on this bad night air had by the 1700s picked up a name straight from Italian doctors describing the swamps outside Rome: malaria, bad air. That name never went away. We still use it today, we just write it as one word now, malaria, and most people saying it out loud have no idea they are quoting a medical diagnosis from long before anyone actually understood what caused the disease. Here in the United States, this was never some distant old-world superstition. It was a daily practical concern stretching across entire regions of the country. The lowlands along the Mississippi and the Ohio River carried a reputation for sickness that shaped where families chose to settle, where a farm got built and where it did not. And the numbers behind that fear were not small at all. During the Civil War, by some estimates, somewhere between 50 and 80 out of every 100 soldiers stationed in certain camps fell ill with this fever at some point during their service. Not from bullets, from the air around their own tents or so, nearly everyone at the time firmly believed. Here's the strange part, and I think it says something worth remembering. Army doctors on both sides of that war already had a treatment that actually worked, a bitter powder called quinine, handed out by the spoonful to feverish soldiers with real success. Nobody in that army tent could have explained why it worked. They had simply learned through trial and hard experience that it did. Sometimes medicine gets ahead of the explanation for it treating a wound correctly for decades before anyone can say precisely why the treatment succeeds. Would you have wanted your own regiment camped anywhere near a river bottom hearing that kind of number? Washington's swampy reputation produced some strange medical conclusions over the years, and one story in particular still raises an eyebrow every time I come across it. In the spring of 1857, President-elect James Buchanan and hundreds of other guests fell seriously ill after staying at one of the city's finest hotels right before his own inauguration. Roughly 36 people eventually died from it. Doctors ruled out ordinary poison fairly quickly, since some guests who had never eaten or had a single drink inside the building still came down with the exact same symptoms. So the medical community settled on a familiar old diagnosis: malaria caused naturally by foul air rising off the nearby waterway. Almost nobody at the time seriously entertained the far more mundane possibility that a hotel packed with hundreds of guests might simply have had a contaminated water supply or a failing pipe somewhere beneath its own floors. When bad air is the only explanation you have for sickness, every single outbreak starts to look like fresh proof of bad air, whether the actual evidence points there or not. Part of the reason the particular diagnosis felt so believable is that the city had honestly earned its swampy reputation. For most of the 1800s, Washington sat beside a body of water called the Washington City Canal, fed by a creek that regularly overflowed its banks and left the ground around the National Mall looking and smelling like an actual swamp. In May of 1881, the fever reached all the way into the White House itself, when First Lady Lucretia Garfield fell seriously ill with it. A newspaper writer covering the story noted without a hint of doubt that the mansion itself sat exactly where river vapours could work freely on everyone living inside it. The whole country took notice. The following year, a Washington physician named Albert Freeman Africanus King stood before the Philosophical Society of the city and did something almost nobody else in his profession was doing at the time. He argued point by point 19 separate reasons why he believed mosquitoes, not bad air, were the true cause of the sickness plaguing his own patients. Nobody quite believed him, but King was so convinced of his own theory that he later proposed something almost too strange to say out loud on a bedtime story. A screen of wire mesh tall enough to cover the entire National Mall, rising as high as the Washington Monument itself, over 500 feet in the air, built to keep every last mosquito away from the capital of the United States. It was never built, of course. Try picturing it for a second anyway. A wall of fine wire mesh taller than any building in the entire country at the time, wrapped around the lawns and monuments of the nation's capital, built for no reason other than to stop something most people could barely be bothered to swat away from their own dinner table. But somewhere in Washington, more than 15 years before, anyone could prove King correct. One lone doctor had already pointed with real conviction straight at the actual culprit, and almost nobody around him was willing to listen. Meanwhile, ordinary households simply followed the advice available to them, which had nothing to do with mosquitoes at all. A respected Cincinnati physician named Daniel Drake wrote in 1850 that shutting every window before sleep during the late summer and fall was not just wise, it was necessary to keep out what he called the poison of the marsh. A popular author of the era named Catherine Beecher went even further, warning her readers that ordinary garden plants released harmful vapours once the sun went down, and that healthy people, especially women and children, ought to stay indoors entirely once evening arrived. Would you have followed that advice yourself, coming from a respected doctor, with no way on earth to check whether he was right? Some households carried the belief even further than a shuttered window. There was a real sincerely held idea in certain circles that families living on the upper floors of a building were somehow safer than families on the ground floor, since this poisoned air was thought to be heavier than ordinary air, and settled low, hugging the earth before it ever reached a second story. In some cities, wealthier residents quite literally paid extra for altitude, floor by floor, chasing distance from a danger nobody could see, weigh or prove. Other families took a more active approach, keeping small fires burning outside at dusk, sometimes tossing on green wood or resin, just to build up a thick, lingering smoke, convinced that a haze of their own making could filter the poison out of the evening air before it ever reached a sleeping child. It rarely worked the way anyone hoped, but it must have felt like doing something, and when you cannot see the danger threatening your family, doing something, almost anything, tends to feel a great deal better than doing nothing at all. None of this sat on the fringe of medicine either. It sat right at the centre of respectable 19th-century thinking. A great many public health reformers of the era built entire careers on one guiding assumption. If something smelled foul, it was almost certainly making you sick. Bad smell, bad health. That link felt obvious to nearly everyone, and it shaped how cities laid out their streets, how hospitals were designed, and yes, how ordinary families decided when to open a window and when to nail it shut for the season. Hospitals in this same period were strangely enough fighting the opposite battle over those very same windows, arguing loudly that they needed to stay open, not sealed, but that particular argument belongs to a very different story. One we'll get to before this night is over. For decades, nobody could offer real physical proof either way. Then, in 1880, a French army surgeon named Alphonse Laveran, stationed in a military hospital in Algeria, looked through his microscope at a drop of blood taken from a feverish soldier and noticed something moving inside the red blood cells that had no business being there. A living, single-celled parasite. He had found the actual cause of a fever that had haunted river towns and army camps for generations, and it had nothing whatsoever to do with foul smells rising off a swamp after dark. But a parasite still needed some way of travelling from one body to the next, and that piece of the puzzle took almost 20 more years to fall into place. A British doctor working in India named Ronald Ross spent years dissecting mosquito after mosquito, species after species in stifling heat coming up empty every single time, until a colleague named Patrick Manson convinced him to keep going and to pay closer attention to one particular kind. In August of 1897, working almost entirely alone in a small laboratory, Ross finally opened the stomach lining of an Anopheles mosquito that had recently fed on a malaria patient, and there, under his own microscope after years of failure, he found the very same parasite Laveran had discovered quietly developing inside the insect itself. The mosquito was never just a nuisance buzzing near your ear in the dark. It was the courier. Ross would go on to receive a Nobel Prize for that single patient afternoon of work. So here is where tonight's story earns its place in this whole series. The fear had been aimed entirely at the wrong target the whole time. There was no poison drifting on the evening air. There was no danger in a plant breathing out its own vapour after sunset. And yet by pure accident an entire century of frightened families sealing their windows at dusk had been doing something quietly effective the whole time, without ever once understanding why. The specific mosquitoes responsible for spreading malaria feed almost exclusively between dusk and dawn. That is simply their biological clock hardwired and consistent, long before anyone alive understood that insects could carry disease at all. A family shutting every window in the house the moment the sun went down was not stopping bad air from getting in. They were entirely by accident keeping out the one insect actually capable of infecting them. Wrong reason, right result. I have to admit there is something almost moving about that once you sit with it for a moment. A wrong theory built on centuries of guesswork and honest fear still managed to produce a truly protective habit, purely because the wrong conclusion happened to point toward the right window at the right hour. But let's not romanticize this too quickly, because the same belief also caused real avoidable harm just in a different direction entirely. Sealing a house shut every single night, especially through long winters, trapped smoke from coal and wood fires indoors, along with everything a family exhaled into that same sealed room, hour after hour all night long. By the very end of the century, some doctors had begun openly fighting the night air superstition themselves, specifically for patients suffering from consumption, what we would call tuberculosis today, arguing that fresh air even after dark did far more good than harm for damaged lungs. One physician writing in the 1890s called the fear of night air one of the most costly superstitions of the age, insisting his own patients recovered faster with a window cracked open than sealed permanently shut. So which was it? Was shutting that window wisdom, or the very thing making some patients worse? Honestly, the answer depends entirely on which room you happen to be standing in and which danger was actually waiting outside it. That particular night, malaria carrying mosquitoes near a swamp, or simply stale smoke-filled air trapped above a sickbed. The people living through it had no real way of knowing which explanation applied to their own house on any given evening. They just followed the advice they were given and hoped for the best. That more than anything else might be the honest lesson worth carrying out of tonight's story. Most of us alive right now are still doing some version of the exact same thing. Following health advice we never personally tested, trusting a reason we were simply handed by somebody with more letters after their name than we have, and hoping the guess underneath it happens to be a good one. Sometimes it is, and sometimes, like Albert King standing in front of a room full of skeptical colleagues in 1882, it takes years, occasionally decades, before anyone else is willing to believe the person who happened to be right all along. I don't think that makes those Victorian families foolish, and I would gently push back on anyone who watches a story like this one, just to feel superior to the people living through it. They were doing exactly what any of us would do, reasoning carefully from the evidence sitting right in front of them, the smell, the swamp, the sickness that always seemed to follow. They simply lacked one tool we now take completely for granted, a microscope powerful enough to show them the truth, swimming in a single drop of blood. Given the same evidence and none of our tools, I'm not entirely convinced the rest of us would have done any better. And once science finally did understand what was actually flying through those open windows after dark, the next great medical fight of the century stopped being about explaining an invisible danger. It became about convincing an entire population to accept an invisible defense against one delivered straight into their own arm, whether they wanted it there or not. On a cold morning in March of 1885, the streets of an English city called Leicester, filled with more people than the entire town of Leicester itself had ever gathered in one place before. Somewhere between 80 and 100,000 of them marching together, banners stretched overhead, brass bands somewhere in the crowd, keeping the whole procession moving in step. Near the front of that crowd, several men carried something small and white above their shoulders. A child's coffin, empty, held up for the whole street to see. And further along, dangling from a rope, swayed a straw effigy of a man who had been dead for more than 60 years, a doctor named Edward Jenner, about to be hanged and then beheaded in front of a cheering crowd. Jenner had never set foot anywhere near Leicester in his entire life. He had been gone from this world since 1823, so why more than half a century after his death was a whole English city burning him in effigy over a needle? To understand that morning, we need to go back almost 90 years earlier to a much quieter scene in the English countryside. Smallpox, by the time Jenner came along, had been terrorizing entire populations for centuries. It did not care who you were, rich or poor, farmer or nobleman. It moved through households, leaving raised fluid-filled sores across the face and body, fevers that could last for weeks, and for the survivors scarring that marked a person for the rest of their life. The more severe strain of the disease killed somewhere around 30 out of every 100 people it infected, and left many of the survivors permanently disfigured, sometimes blinded. There was no cure. The only real defense available was a risky older practice called variolation, deliberately infecting a healthy person with a small amount of actual smallpox itself, hoping for a mild case instead of a fatal one, which sometimes worked and sometimes did not, occasionally starting entirely new outbreaks by accident. Jenner, working as a country doctor in Gloucestershire, had heard the same folk story for years from local farmers. Dairymaids who caught a much milder illness called cowpox from their cows never seemed to catch smallpox afterward. He first heard the idea as a young apprentice, and by his own account he spent the better part of 25 years turning it over in his mind, before he finally tested it properly. He was not even the first person to try it quietly on his own family. A farmer named Benjamin Jesty had done something similar decades earlier, with no formal training and no interest in publishing his results. But it was Jenner's careful documentation and his relentless promotion of what he had found that eventually convinced the wider world to pay attention. In May of 1796, he took material from a fresh cowpox sore on the hand of a dairymaid named Sarah Nelmes and used it to inoculate an 8-year-old boy named James Phipps. The boy developed a mild fever, recovered within days, and when Jenner later exposed him to actual smallpox, nothing happened. The boy was protected. That single careful experiment eventually gave the world the word vaccine, borrowed straight from the Latin word for cow. And for the better part of the next century, that discovery would save more human lives than almost any other single medical breakthrough in history. Word of what Jenner had found spread across Europe astonishingly fast, and it earned him admiration in places you would not necessarily expect. Napoleon himself had every soldier in the French army vaccinated, and even awarded Jenner a medal for it, despite France and Britain being locked in open war at the time. When Jenner once asked the French emperor to release 2 British men being held as prisoners, Napoleon granted the request without hesitation, reportedly saying he could refuse that particular doctor nothing. Jenner, by every account, was treated during his own lifetime as something bordering on a global hero, celebrated even by his own country's enemies, which makes what happened 60 years later back on the streets of Leicester all the more striking to sit with. So you would think, given everything smallpox had already taken from families across the country, that vaccination would have been welcomed everywhere with open arms and rolled-up sleeves. It was not that simple. In 1840, Parliament passed the very first Vaccination Act, offering the procedure free of charge to every family in the country, and outlawing the older, riskier practice of variolation entirely, since a deliberately infected person could still spread full-strength smallpox to everybody around them while they recovered. It was voluntary, and that turned out to be the problem, at least from the government's point of view. Uptake stayed stubbornly low, especially among poorer families who distrusted doctors, distrusted the government, or simply could not spare a day's wages to travel and wait in line for a procedure nobody was forcing them to get. By 1853, officials had grown impatient with how slowly that voluntary approach was working. One public health official of the time wrote with open frustration that what he called the lower and uneducated classes had shown nothing but indolence and indifference toward the free vaccination services already sitting right in front of them. That framing matters more than it might seem, because it tells you exactly how this next law was going to be written, and precisely who it was aimed at from the very beginning. Not the country as a whole, but specifically the poor, the very people least equipped to challenge it in court. Parliament passed a new Vaccination Act that same year, making the procedure compulsory for every infant under 3 months old. Parents who refused now faced a fine, or worse, could be sent straight to prison for it. Here's the part that tends to surprise people. Even with fines and prison sentences now hanging over every household, the new law barely moved the needle, if you'll forgive the phrase. Historians studying vaccination records from this period estimate that even after 1853, still less than a third of infants in the country were actually being vaccinated in any given year. Threatening people with punishment, it turned out, was nowhere near as effective as the government had assumed it would be. People found ways around it, moved between parishes, or simply accepted the occasional fine as the cost of doing things their own way. Would you have trusted a government that had just called you lazy and ignorant to now stick a needle in your infant's arm? For a while, the law had a loophole. A court case in 1864 established that a family could only be fined once per unvaccinated child, no matter how many times they continued to refuse afterward. Some families simply paid the single fine, and considered the matter permanently settled, a one-time toll for keeping their child exactly as they were. Parliament sealed off that gap in 1867, extending the requirement all the way up to age 14 and allowing magistrates to issue fines again and again and again for the exact same act of refusal, essentially forever, until either the family gave in or ran out of money to keep paying. This is roughly where the resistance stopped being scattered, grumbling, and started becoming an organised movement. Groups calling themselves the Anti-Vaccination League and the Anti-Compulsory Vaccination League sprang up across the country, printing their own pamphlets, running their own journals, and organising meetings in town halls up and down England, and nowhere took up their cause more fiercely than the city of Leicester, where a local branch had already formed by 1869. Newspapers from the period describe whole families choosing prison over compliance almost as a badge of honour, something closer to a public declaration than a punishment. One local paper described a young mother and two men arm in arm being escorted through the streets by a crowd banners raised on their way to willingly surrender themselves to the police rather than let their children be vaccinated. The crowd around them reportedly cheered 3 times over as the cell doors shut behind them, as though watching a hero head off to battle rather than a defendant walking into a jail cell. I want to pause here for a moment because I think it's worth resisting the easy version of this story, the one where these parents just written off as ignorant or reckless or anti-science full stop. Some of their objections were rooted in bad information without question, but a portion of that anger was also aimed squarely at something else, a government that had shown up in poor neighbourhoods with contempt in one hand and a legal threat in the other, and expected trust in return. That combination rarely goes well in any century, and going to prison was never a small thing for a working family to risk. A father or mother locked away for even a handful of days often meant lost wages the household could not afford to lose, sometimes meant hungry children waiting at home, and yet families kept choosing that cost anyway again and again because to them it felt smaller than the alternative. By the way, that little round scar many older people still carry on their upper arm, the one most of us barely think twice about, traces directly back to this same procedure. For over a century it quietly marked who had been vaccinated and who had not, long before anyone thought to ask a person's permission to look. Then, between 1870 and 1873, a massive smallpox epidemic swept across England and Wales, killing over 42,000 people in just 3 years, the kind of number that touched nearly every parish in the country in one way or another. Parliament's answer was to tighten the law again in 1871, adding even more enforcement power behind it, appointing dedicated vaccination officers whose entire job was tracking down families who had not complied, going house to house, with the full weight of the law behind them. In poorer neighbourhoods, that officer's knock on the door became a truly dreaded sound, not unlike a debt collector, except the debt being called in was your own child's arm. It's also worth saying plainly that not everyone objecting to the law was driven by the same reason. Some families distrusted the science itself, not unreasonably, given how young the whole field of medicine still was. Others objected on religious grounds, uneasy about injecting material taken from an animal into a human body at all. And plenty more simply resented being told what to do with their own children by a parliament that had never once set foot in their street. Lump them all together as one angry, ignorant mob, and you miss almost everything interesting about why this fight lasted as long as it did, and the resistance, rather than breaking under that pressure, only grew louder, more organised, and considerably more theatrical, which finally brings us back to that cold March morning in 1885, and the effigy of a man who had done nothing but try to save lives dangling from a rope over a crowd that had travelled from every corner of the country to be there. Some had come by train the night before, sleeping wherever they could find space just to be present for it. It remains one of the largest public demonstrations Britain had seen, up to that point in its history, over a medical procedure that statistically had already prevented an almost unimaginable number of deaths. Here's the detail I find most fascinating in this entire story, and it rarely makes it into the shorter versions people tell online. Leicester did not simply protest and walk away satisfied. The city put forward an actual alternative, and then proved with real numbers that it worked. Local health officials began aggressively tracking every new case of smallpox the moment it appeared, moving infected patients into isolation, almost immediately disinfecting their homes and belongings, and containing outbreaks street by street before they could spread from house to house, instead of relying on universal vaccination alone. By 1877, a report from the city's own medical officer showed that despite an active outbreak, smallpox had caused only 6 deaths in the entire city that year. 6. In a country where a single epidemic elsewhere had just killed 42,000 people, this approach became known simply as the Leicester method, and it worked well enough that in 1879 Parliament granted the city its own special legal act, formally recognising rapid notification and quarantine as a legitimate alternative path right alongside compulsory vaccination itself. So who was right? The government demanding compliance, or the crowd demanding the freedom to refuse? Honestly, I don't think this story hands us a clean winner, and I would be a little suspicious of anyone who tells you it does. Vaccination, broadly speaking, went on to save an extraordinary number of lives across the following century, eventually helping wipe smallpox off the face of the earth entirely. One of the genuine triumphs of medical history achieved nowhere else in human history against any other disease before or since. And yet Leicester also proved with its own carefully kept records that a community could protect itself without forcing a needle into every single arm by law. Both of those things are true at once, sitting right next to each other uncomfortably, and this exact tension between what protects the many and what belongs to the individual has never fully gone away. You can probably think of a modern headline or two where some version of it is still playing out today, just with different diseases, different decades, and a different crowd standing in a different street. What Leicester actually stumbled onto almost by necessity, born out of pure defiance, rather than any grand design, was something quieter than a protest march, and arguably more useful in the long run. If you catch a disease early enough, and you know exactly where it's hiding, you don't always need to fight over everybody's arm at once. Word of that idea did not stay contained to one city on the edge of the English countryside for very long. Officials in London were already taking notice, poring over Leicester's own numbers with real interest, and within just a few years they would attempt to build a version of that local experiment into national law. No longer asking what you were willing to let a doctor put into your body, but something altogether different. What you are now legally required to tell the authorities the very moment illness crossed your own front door, and how quickly your entire household might find itself quite literally marked and watched because of it. Somewhere on a quiet residential street in the north of England, sometime in the 1890s, a horse-drawn vehicle turns the corner and every curtain on the block twitches at once. Nobody needs to be told what it means. Children stop playing mid-game, frozen in place. Neighbours step out onto their front steps, careful to keep a proper distance, and watch the way people watch a house fire, unable to look away, even though nothing about the scene invites them closer. This particular vehicle has a nickname, one that grown adults said with real dread in their voice: the fever van. Somewhere inside that house, a family has just done something the law now required of them. They told the truth about a sick child. Before we go further, it helps to understand exactly what that family was so afraid of. Scarlet fever. One of the diseases most likely to bring that van rattling down the street spread through households with brutal speed, a fiery red rash spreading across the body, a raw, swollen throat, and fevers that could climb dangerously high within a single day. Nobody at the time understood it was caused by a strain of bacteria closely related to the one behind strep throat today. All they knew was that it moved from child to child inside a house, a school, or a street, faster than almost anything else they had ever seen, and that a healthy child in the morning could be desperately ill by evening. By 1889, Parliament had passed something called the Infectious Disease Notification Act, and it changed the basic relationship between an ordinary household and the government in a way most families had never experienced before. The moment a doctor diagnosed one of a long list of dangerous illnesses, smallpox, diphtheria, scarlet fever, typhoid, typhus, and several others, besides that doctor was now legally bound to report it. So was the head of the household itself if a doctor had not already been called. Failing to notify could bring a fine of up to 40 shillings, a truly painful sum for a working family at the time. Once that report reached the local authorities, the law handed them extraordinary power. They could remove the patient to hospital. They could send inspectors to disinfect the home. They could shut down a school. They could even force a business to stop operating, all without needing permission from the family involved. Would you have told the truth knowing exactly what might roll up outside your door because of it? Not every family did, if we're being honest about it. Public health records from the period are full of complaints from doctors and inspectors about parents who delayed calling for help as long as they possibly could, hoping a fever might simply pass on its own before anybody official needed to know about it, or who quietly kept a sick child indoors and away from windows for as long as the illness allowed, buying an extra day or two before the truth became impossible to hide. None of that quiet resistance was ever written into the law books, but it shaped how the whole system actually functioned in practice, a constant unspoken negotiation between families protecting their own and officials trying to protect everyone else. None of this began in 1889, by the way. The idea of pulling sick patients away from healthy households had been quietly tested for over a century before Parliament ever made it compulsory. A physician named Dr. Haygarth had set up some of the earliest dedicated fever wards in the town of Cheltenham all the way back in 1783, convinced that keeping the sick physically apart from the healthy could slow an outbreak even without knowing anything about germs, working purely from careful observation of which households caught a fever and which ones somehow escaped it. By 1802, London had its own version, a tiny establishment called a House of Recovery, opened on a street called Constitution Road, with room for exactly 15 patients and 3 nurses, a handful of beds against an entire city's worth of fevers. It grew over the following decades into the London Fever Hospital, one of the most important institutions of its kind anywhere in the country. What the 1889 law actually did was take an idea that had already been proving itself slowly and unevenly for 100 years, in a scattering of individual towns and individual doctors willing to try something unpopular and finally make it the law of the land rather than a matter of local choice. Here's how the actual process worked once the law took hold, and it's worth walking through slowly because the mechanics themselves tell you a great deal about the era. A doctor examining a feverish child would confirm the diagnosis, then send word as quickly as possible to the local health board by day through a clerk's office, and by night straight to the nearest ambulance station. In London specifically, the organisation responsible for running this entire system, called the Metropolitan Asylums Board, had actually begun its work back in 1870, initially admitting only relapsing fever and smallpox cases. Typhus, enteric fever, and scarlet fever were added to the list the following year. Diphtheria, surprisingly, was not formally included until 1888, meaning the list of diseases considered dangerous enough to warrant this kind of forced removal kept quietly expanding year after year as doctors learned more about which illnesses truly justified it. If a hospital bed happened to be available, help arrived remarkably fast. Some accounts from the period describe the ambulances themselves as surprisingly well appointed, fitted with an air-filled mattress, hot water bottles for the journey, and even small refreshments for the frightened child being carried away. Somebody somewhere in that system clearly understood that comfort mattered, even while the entire process remained terrifying for everyone involved, because underneath all that careful planning sat a much harder truth. Once the fever van pulled away from a house, there was a real chance the child inside it would never come home again. Scarlet fever and diphtheria, the two most common reasons for that van to appear on your street, killed a meaningful share of the children who caught them, and hospital isolation, whatever its benefits for the wider neighbourhood, offered no guarantee for the individual child sealed away inside it. There was also a quieter dilemma sitting on the doctor's side of that front door, one that rarely gets mentioned. A family physician in this era often knew a household personally had delivered the children, treated the grandparents sat at kitchen tables through better and worse years. That same doctor was now legally bound to report a diagnosis he knew might rip that family apart within the hour, whether or not he privately believed hospital isolation was truly necessary for this particular case. Plenty of country doctors, according to letters and records from the period, agonized openly over that exact conflict, caught between the law they had sworn to follow and the trust a family had placed in them personally. Some, it seems, quietly softened a diagnosis where they judged the risk to be honestly low, choosing to treat a mild case at home, rather than trigger the entire machinery of removal and disinfection over what they suspected, rightly or wrongly, was not truly dangerous. Whether that quiet judgment made them compassionate or reckless probably depended entirely on which side of the front door you happened to be standing on. One woman, remembering her own childhood decades later, described exactly what happened after she was carried off with scarlet fever. A health inspector arrived at her family's house almost immediately to fumigate the room she'd been sleeping in. She spent an entire month inside an isolation ward afterward, and the only contact she had with her own mother during that entire month was watching her stand on a chair outside the ward window twice a week, just so the two of them could see each other's faces through the glass. No conversation, no touch, just two faces on either side of a pane of glass for as many minutes as the hospital staff allowed, before someone gently asked the mother to step back down, sit with that image for a second. A mother climbing onto a chair in all weather twice a week for an entire month, because standing on the ground simply was not tall enough to reach her own child's window. The disinfection itself was its own small tragedy separate from the illness. Health inspectors did not simply air out a bedroom and call it finished. Toys were destroyed outright, sometimes right in front of a grieving sibling still living in the house. Books, often a family's only ones, were burned rather than risk them carrying the sickness forward. Walls, floors, and furniture were scrubbed down with harsh chemical solutions strong enough to strip paint, and in many homes the wallpaper itself was torn away and burned along with everything else the child had touched. A family could walk back into their own home afterward and barely recognize the room where their child used to sleep, stripped bare, smelling of chemicals, instead of the child who had lived there only days before. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say the fever van represented something bigger than public health policy. It represented the government's authority walking straight through your front door in full view of everybody on the street, whether you'd asked for it or not. And that visibility was very much the point. Neighbours were not simply passive bystanders in this system. They became, whether they wanted the role or not, a kind of informal watch committee, keeping track of which houses had been visited, which children had disappeared for weeks at a time, and whose family, fairly or not now, carried a certain reputation up and down the block. A household marked this way could find itself quietly avoided for months afterward, invitations that stopped arriving, children steered away from playing in that particular yard, all of it happening without a single unkind word ever being spoken directly to the family's face. Would you have wanted your own neighbours knowing the very same afternoon exactly which illness was inside your walls? Here's where the story gets more complicated than the simple version usually told, and it's the part I find most honest about this whole chapter. The fever hospitals themselves were not universally embraced as an obvious public good, even by contemporaries living through it. In parts of London, residents living near a fever hospital took legal action against having one built nearby, at all worried not without some basis that a building full of contagious patients might actually increase the risk of infection in the surrounding streets rather than reduce it. And in at least a few documented cases that fear turned out to have merit. Smallpox rates were observed rising in neighbourhoods situated near smallpox hospitals, likely from infected linen careless staff or patients travelling to and from the building itself. So the very tool built to contain disease sometimes became one more way of spreading it, depending entirely on how carefully it was run. There's an even stranger wrinkle buried in the public health records from this period, one that rarely makes it into the tidy version of this story. Different cities in Britain tried different combinations of these tools, sometimes almost as unintentional experiments running side by side. Glasgow leaned heavily on hospital isolation without much formal notification. Dundee did almost the opposite, strong notification requirements, with very little hospital isolation to back it up. Edinburgh tried using both together, the full combination notification and isolation working side by side, and the town of Leith, just next door to Edinburgh, essentially used neither one in any serious way. When public health officials later compared the death rates from scarlet fever across all four places, the reduction in Leith and Dundee actually came out slightly ahead of Edinburgh and Glasgow, the two cities using the most aggressive combined approach. Nobody at the time could fully explain why. It seemed to have far more to do with which strain of the illness happened to be circulating that particular year than with which policy a city had chosen to fight it. Doesn't that complicate the story in a satisfying way? We like tidy lessons from history, the kind where the brave modern approach clearly wins, and the old fearful instincts clearly lose. Reality, as usual, was messier than that. I bring that up not to suggest the whole system was pointless, because plenty of evidence from this same period shows early notification and rapid isolation saving lives in a great many towns. I bring it up because I think it's worth remembering that even the people running this system at the time were still guessing, adjusting and comparing notes as they went, the same as anyone trying to solve an unfamiliar problem with imperfect tools. We tend to look back at history and assume the people living through it had far more confidence in their own methods than they actually did. What strikes me most turning the story over is how much it really asked of ordinary people, not obedience to a doctor alone the way a vaccination law might. This law asked something quieter, and in its own way harder. It asked a frightened parent to send word to the doctor or answer honestly at the front door, knowing full well what might be waiting outside within the hour. Most of them did it anyway, not because the fever van felt safe, because the alternative, watching an entire street quietly fall ill while you stayed silent to protect your own privacy, felt very possibly worse. Would you have made the same choice standing at that door knowing your neighbours were already watching from behind their own curtains? That particular tension between what a household is willing to say out loud and what the law now demands they say regardless never really left us. It just changes its shape from one century to the next, one disease to the next, one knock on the door to the next. We are still in our own quieter ways deciding what we owe our neighbours versus what belongs only to our own front room. And in a strange way, that instinct to hide what happens behind a shut door to protect a body living or otherwise from the eyes of the law reaches back even further than any fever van. Long before Parliament ever asked a family to report a sick child, it had already fought an uglier, far bloodier battle over an entirely different kind of body. The ones that could no longer speak for themselves at all, and what the law believed it was allowed to do with them once the breathing finally stopped and no fever van in the world could carry them anywhere ever again. In the autumn of 1828, in a cramped lodging house on a narrow Edinburgh street called Tanner's Close, two lodgers named James and Anne Gray went looking for a missing bundle of stockings. What they found instead, tucked beneath a straw-filled bed, was the body of a woman who'd been staying in the room the night before. They had not been told she was dead. Nobody had been told anything at all. The couple who ran that lodging house, William Burke and William Hare, were about to become two of the most talked-about men in the whole of Britain, not because they had robbed a single grave in their entire lives, which is the strange part almost nobody remembers correctly. They never dug anyone up. What they had done instead was arguably worse, and it forced an entire country to finally ask an uncomfortable question. Once your breathing stops, who actually decides what happens to what's left of you? To understand why two ordinary lodging house keepers turned into murderers, you first have to understand just how desperate medical schools of the era had become for one very specific, very grim resource: bodies. Doctors could not learn anatomy from books alone. They needed to open an actual human body and see with their own eyes exactly how everything inside connected. The true shape of a heart, the actual path of an artery, details no illustration could fully teach. But the law only allowed medical schools one legitimate source of cadavers, the corpses of executed murderers, and Britain simply was not producing enough hanged criminals to keep every anatomy classroom in the country supplied. In Edinburgh alone, a wildly popular anatomist named Robert Knox was teaching classes packed with several hundred students in a single term, and by some estimates needed hundreds of bodies a year just to keep his lectures running the way he had promised his students they would. That shortage had already given rise to a shadow industry of men known as resurrection. Men who dug up freshly buried bodies under cover of darkness and sold them quietly to medical schools that, in fairness, rarely asked too many questions about where a body had come from. Families terrified of this exact fate had begun paying for heavy iron cages called mort safes to be locked over freshly dug graves sturdy enough to hold firm until decomposition made a body worthless to any anatomist or hiring watchman to sit through the freezing night beside a loved one's resting place until enough time had passed to make theft pointless. It was in its own grim way an entire economy built around a single unavoidable fact: medicine needed the dead more urgently than the law was willing to admit, and somebody somewhere was always going to find a way to fill that gap. Burke and Hare, though, found a shortcut that skipped the graveyard altogether. It began, according to their own later testimony, almost by accident. In November of 1827, an elderly army pensioner living in Hare's lodging house died owing £4 in unpaid rent. Rather than simply losing that money, Hare proposed something bold: sell the body itself to a medical school and recover the debt that way. Burke agreed. The two men packed the coffin with bark to disguise the missing weight, carried the actual body across the city, and were eventually directed toward the private anatomy school of Dr. Robert Knox. Knox examined the corpse, asked remarkably few questions, and paid the two men £7 and 10 shillings for it, an enormous sum for two struggling labourers, worth several months of honest wages in a single transaction. One of Knox's own assistants told them as they were leaving that the doctor would be glad to see them again if they ever had another body to sell. That single sentence changed everything. Would you have walked away from that kind of money if you were standing exactly where they were standing that morning? Not long afterward, another lodger in the same house, a sick miller named Joseph, took a turn for the worse. Hare worried openly that a visibly ill tenant would frighten away paying guests. Rather than wait for illness to run its natural course, the two men got him drunk and smothered him, pressing down on his chest and holding his jaw shut until he stopped breathing. No blood, no obvious wound, just a method so simple and so hard to detect after the fact that it would eventually earn its own grim name in the English language itself. To burke someone meaning to quietly suffocate a person and dispose of the evidence entered common speech directly because of what happened in that lodging house. Over the following year, Burke and Hare, sometimes joined by their common law wives, killed at least 16 people this way. 12 women, 3 men, and 1 child. According to the best surviving records, most of them drawn from, among the most invisible members of Edinburgh society, the elderly, the drunk, the mentally unwell travellers passing through with nobody nearby to notice they had gone missing. One of their victims stood out from the rest precisely because he was not invisible at all. A young man known across the city simply as Daft Jamie, a familiar face on Edinburgh's streets, well-liked and instantly recognisable to almost everyone who passed him, the kind of local character who belonged to the whole neighbourhood in a way strangers passing through never could. Unlike most of their previous victims, Jamie refused the whiskey they offered him, stayed sober enough to fight back hard, and very nearly escaped with his life. He did not. And according to several accounts from the period, Knox worried that dissecting a face half the city would recognise might raise uncomfortable questions among his own students had the head and feet removed before the body was presented for the lecture, erasing the one part of Jamie that could have given him away. I want to pause on that detail for a moment because I think it says something important about how willing an otherwise respected, educated man can become to look away from an inconvenient truth, so long as looking away serves his own reputation and his own convenience. Knox never publicly asked where these remarkably fresh bodies kept coming from, arriving with almost suspicious regularity in almost suspiciously good condition. Whether that was true ignorance or a very convenient kind of blindness is a question historians still argue over, and I suspect it was honestly a little of both. Knox himself was never formally charged with any crime. A committee investigated his conduct and cleared him of direct legal responsibility, technically speaking, since he had never actually swung the murder weapon or held a hand over anyone's mouth. But public opinion delivered its own verdict regardless. Effigies of Knox were burned in the street, his lectures were disrupted by furious crowds, and his professional reputation in Edinburgh never recovered. He eventually left the city altogether, spending the remainder of his career practicing quietly in London, a long way from the medical school where his name had once meant packed lecture halls and a waiting list of eager students. The end came on the last night of October 1828, with a woman named Margaret Docherty lured into Burke's lodgings under the pretence of a family connection that did not exist. Burke's other lodgers, James and Anne Gray, were sent away for the night so the murder could happen undisturbed. When the Grays returned home the next morning and were suspiciously barred from a particular room, their curiosity finally got the better of them, and that is exactly when they found her body hidden beneath the bed. Helen MacDougall, Burke's common law wife, tried desperately to buy the couple's silence, offering them a weekly payment to simply forget what they had seen. They refused and went straight to the police instead. At trial, William Hare made a calculated decision that still leaves a bitter taste in most retellings of this story. He agreed to testify in full detail against his own partner, in exchange for complete immunity from prosecution, describing in his own words exactly how each killing had been carried out. Burke was convicted on the strength of that testimony alone, since almost no other hard evidence survived to connect either man directly to most of the 16 deaths. Hare walked free and effectively vanished from history afterward, reportedly fleeing Scotland under a false name to avoid the fury of a public that considered him every bit as guilty as the man now facing the noose, while the partner standing beside him for over a dozen murders faced the entire weight of the law alone. William Burke was hanged in Edinburgh on the 28th of January 1829, in front of a crowd estimated at roughly 25,000 people, an almost unimaginable turnout for a single execution. More people than lived in many entire towns across the country at the time. Some in the crowd reportedly camped out through the freezing night before unwilling to risk losing their spot for the morning spectacle. The shouting by most accounts was not sorrow. It was something closer to celebration. And then in a final twist that feels almost too neat to be true, his body was handed over for public dissection just days later by one of Knox's own professional rivals in the very same kind of anatomy theatre that Burke's victims had been carried into. Reportedly, the dissecting professor even used a small amount of Burke's own blood to write out a short note documenting the occasion, a strange, almost theatrical flourish to end such a grim chapter. Burke's skeleton still stands today in Edinburgh's Anatomical Museum, and on the very first day it went on public display, more than 30,000 people reportedly came through to see it, a queue of onlookers nearly as large as the crowd that had watched him hang. Perhaps most unsettling of all, several items made from his own skin, including a small pocketbook and a card case, survive in museum collections in Edinburgh. To this day, quiet, permanent reminders that his own body ultimately met precisely the fate he had sold 16 other bodies toward. Would you call that justice, or simply the same appetite that killed those 16 people, now finally satisfied by a 17th? Public fury over the entire affair did not fade quietly. Parliament, under real pressure to prevent anything like it from happening again, passed the Anatomy Act in 1832. On paper, it solved the cadaver shortage that had driven Burke and Hare toward murder in the first place. Medical schools could now legally claim any unclaimed body from a workhouse, a hospital, or a prison, so long as nobody came forward to bury it within 48 hours of death. Here's the part of this story that deserves far more attention than it usually gets. That law did not spread the burden evenly across British society. It fell almost entirely on the poor. Anyone with a family able to pay for a funeral was safe from this fate, by default protected simply by having somebody willing and able to claim their body in time. It was destitution itself, not any crime, that now legally exposed a person's body to the exact same dissecting table Burke's victims had been carried to. Working-class communities at the time understood this perfectly well, and petitions from the period described the law as an insult layered directly on top of poverty, treating an empty pocket in death almost like a punishment usually reserved for murderers. Die rich and your body belonged to your family. Die poor, alone and unclaimed within 2 days, and your body now legally belonged to whichever medical school needed a lecture demonstration that particular week. Would you have trusted a government that had just watched an entire city celebrate a hanging to now decide fairly which bodies among the poor were worth protecting? A second closely related case in London only strengthened Parliament's resolve to act. 2 men named John Bishop and Thomas Williams, later nicknamed the London Burkers, in an unmistakable nod to Edinburgh's own scandal, were caught attempting to sell the body of a young boy to a London anatomy school in 1831, having killed him, using a method disturbingly similar to the one Burke and Hare had made infamous just a few years earlier. It turned out Bishop had likely been selling bodies to anatomists for years already. Most of them probably obtained the traditional way dug from fresh graves, before he too eventually crossed the same line from theft into murder. Coming so soon after Burke and Hare, with the wound from that first scandal still fresh in the public mind, this second case helped push the stalled legislation through Parliament far faster than it might otherwise have moved. Lawmakers who had spent months arguing over the details suddenly found considerably less patience for further delay. So here we land on the uncomfortable centre of tonight's story. A law written specifically to stop the poor from being murdered for their bodies ended up granting the state legal permission to claim those same poor bodies anyway, just without the murder attached to it. Progress in this particular case looks less like a clean line from cruelty to justice, and more like a slow, uneasy trade of one kind of exploitation for a marginally more regulated one. I don't say that to diminish what the Anatomy Act actually accomplished. Grave robbing did decline sharply once bodies could be obtained legally, and medical training truly improved as a result, producing better trained doctors for everyone, rich and poor alike, in the decades that followed. Both of those things can be true at once. A law can solve the exact problem it was written to solve and still quietly punish the very people least able to defend themselves against it, and that uneasy trade, the state deciding which bodies truly belonged to their owners and which ones did not, was never limited to the dead. Sometimes it reached directly into the arms and the small, still-growing spines of the living, especially the very children too young to have any real say in the matter at all, strapped, braced and suspended for their own good by doctors who were in their own way every bit as certain they were right as Robert Knox once was. Picture a small room in New York City sometime in the 1870s, dominated by a strange wooden frame that looks almost like a small gallows. A child hangs from it, arms raised overhead, wrists strapped into a harness, feet barely brushing the floor. The room smells faintly of wet plaster and carbolic soap. Around that child, a doctor and his assistants move quickly, wrapping wet strips of plaster bandage around a small chest and back layer after layer, murmuring instructions to one another while the child simply hangs there suspended in mid-air, waiting for the plaster to set hard. The doctor running that room believed with complete sincerity that he was saving that child's spine. His name was Louis Sayer, and by the time this scene became common practice in his clinic, he had already become one of the most talked about physicians in the United States, the very first person in the country to hold a university chair specifically in orthopedic surgery teaching at Bellevue Hospital Medical College in New York. He was by every account restlessly ambitious, the kind of surgeon who was never quite satisfied treating only one part of the body. Alongside his work on curved spines, he also designed a shoe for children born with clubfoot, and pioneered a surgical technique for a painful hip condition doctors of the time called morbus coxarius, cutting away and reshaping damaged bone in a joint that before his intervention had usually just left a patient permanently unable to walk without severe pain. He would later help found the American Medical Association's own weekly journal, serve as the organization's president, and lecture to packed rooms across 2 continents. But none of that fame came from a plan. It came by his own account from something closer to an accident. In November of 1874, a 4-year-old boy was brought to Sayer's clinic with a sharp curve twisting through the lower part of his spine, along with a partial paralysis affecting one leg, and disturbingly his ability to control his own bowels. Sayer, uncertain exactly how to proceed, and honestly out of more conventional options, asked an assistant to just suspend the boy by the arms, mostly just to see what would happen. What happened surprised everyone standing in that room. The moment the boy's body hung freely stretched by his own weight, The paralyzed leg began moving more freely than it had in longer than anyone could remember. The boy's breathing eased, no longer crowded by a compressed chest. His pain, according to Sayre's own later writing, noticeably lessened right there, hanging in mid-air in front of a room full of watching physicians and a family desperate for any sign of improvement at all. Would you have trusted that same instinct, seeing a child's symptoms ease the moment gravity pulled hardest on an already damaged spine? Sayre did more than trust it. He built an entire treatment around it. Using a tripod frame fitted with ropes and pulleys, not unlike a small piece of construction equipment, repurposed for the human body, he would suspend a young patient by the arms, stretching the curved spine as straight as gravity and their own body weight would allow, and then while the child still hung there, wrap the torso in bandage after bandage of plaster-soaked cloth. Once the plaster hardened into a rigid shell, usually within a matter of minutes the child could finally be lowered back down, now held inside what quickly became known simply as a Sayre jacket, a solid plaster casing running from the hips almost up to the collarbone, locking the spine into whatever position it had been stretched into moments before. Part of what made Sayre's idea spread so quickly was a piece of technology still fairly new to serious medicine at the time: photography. Rather than relying only on written descriptions, which any skeptical colleague could easily dismiss as exaggeration, Sayre commissioned an extensive series of photographs patients shown before treatment, and again afterwards side by side, offering what felt at the time like undeniable visual proof. For doctors reading his book in London or Edinburgh, unable to examine his patients in person, those photographs did an enormous amount of persuasive work all on their own, in a way a page of careful written measurements never quite could. Here's the detail that tends to surprise people most. This was not conceived as some final permanent cure. Sayre originally intended it purely as a temporary measure, something to hold a patient steady only until a proper metal brace could be custom built and fitted, which in that era could take weeks. The plaster jacket was supposed to be the stopgap. Instead, it became the treatment itself, worn by patients for months, at a stretch, sometimes replaced and reapplied again and again as a growing child's body slowly changed shape underneath it. Try to imagine what those months actually felt like from inside that shell. A rigid plaster casing sealed against the skin, offering no real way to scratch an itch that inevitably formed somewhere underneath it, holding heat against the body through long summer afternoons and making it nearly impossible to bend, twist, or curl up comfortably in bed at night. Parents of the era wrote about the difficulty of even bathing a child wearing one of these jackets, and about the strange stiff way a small body moved once locked inside plaster from hip to collarbone. And yet many families kept bringing their children back for reapplication month after month, because whatever discomfort the jacket caused, the alternative, an untreated worsening spinal curve, frightened them considerably more. Word of Sayre's clinic reportedly travelled far enough that families arrived from other states, and eventually other countries entirely, some having spent whatever savings they had on the journey alone, all for a chance at a treatment most had only heard about second-hand, described by a neighbour or a local doctor, or a newspaper article promising a cure their own town's physicians had no way of offering. And there was a real practical argument in its favour, one that deserves to be said plainly rather than dismissed. The iron braces available at the time were expensive, heavy, and often required weeks of careful custom fitting by a specialised instrument maker that many families simply could not afford, both in money and in the time spent travelling back and forth for adjustments. Plaster, by comparison, was cheap, fast to apply in a single office visit, and required no expensive metalwork at all. Sayre marketed his method directly on that advantage, publishing detailed comparisons in his own writing, showing families and doctors alike exactly how much money and waiting time a plaster jacket could save over the older iron alternative. For a working family with a child suffering from a curved spine, that argument mattered enormously, whatever else you might think about the treatment itself. A struggling household did not need the theoretically best possible brace sitting unaffordable in a catalogue somewhere. They needed something they could actually pay for that same week. Sayre's own case notes, later published alongside dozens of photographs in a widely circulated book, describe patient after patient. A 10-and-a-half-year-old girl in Cheltenham, England, whose spine had been damaged by a fall at 19 months old, could initially only stand while supporting herself with her own hands, and reportedly stood far more steadily after treatment. A small, specific victory Sayre clearly took great pride in documenting. A 20-year-old patient named Jessie Brown, photographed both before and after her jacket was applied, reportedly grew a full inch and an eighth taller once the plaster held her spine in its corrected position, a measurement Sayre recorded down to the fraction, the kind of precise, almost boastful detail a proud inventor includes when he wants the whole medical world to notice. Would a single measured inch of height have been enough to convince you this treatment was worth months spent locked inside plaster? When Sayre eventually toured England to demonstrate his technique in person, the reception bordered on adoration. Medical journals of the era described audiences of British physicians responding with visible open emotion during his lectures, applauding results that many of them had assumed were utterly impossible, with a material as ordinary as plaster of Paris. Sayre's own book, published in a British edition the following year, carried a dedication thanking the doctors and surgeons of England for welcoming him so warmly during his visit. One review from the period, written by a fellow physician clearly swept up in the moment, predicted his name would remain tied to the plaster jacket for as long as medicine itself was practiced, whatever critics, rivals, or skeptics might say about it. Imagine for a moment travelling from New York to London with nothing but a bag of plaster bandages and a handful of photographs, and returning home having been treated in certain rooms at least, almost like a conquering hero, and there were skeptics, plenty of them, even at the height of his fame. Sayre faced open criticism from parts of the international medical community, who doubted the treatment's real value, questioning whether he was overselling temporary comfort as genuine correction of the underlying disease. Some rival physicians accused him of rushing his conclusions into print before enough time had passed to know whether his young patients would hold their improvement or quietly relapse once the plaster finally came off for good. At least one formal malpractice case remembered today, only by the names attached to it in old medical records, followed him through the courts, a reminder that not every family who trusted a small body to that hanging frame walked away satisfied. History has not preserved most of those unhappy voices nearly as well as it preserved Sayre's own confident writing, his own carefully measured inches, his own selected photographs chosen specifically to make his case. That imbalance alone is worth remembering. The people who benefit from a new medical idea tend to write the history of it. The people it fails often simply disappear from the record, their disappointment never published in any journal at all. Here's where I think tonight's story asks something a little harder of us than simple admiration or simple outrage. Those photographs Sayre published, the ones meant to document his patients' progress for other doctors to study, show children and young patients posed on his suspension apparatus, sometimes only partly dressed arms stretched overhead entirely at the direction of the adults around them. This was not unusual for medical photography of the era, and Sayre likely never gave the practice a second thought, since documenting a patient thoroughly was considered nothing more than good responsible medicine. But modern historians looking back at that same collection have raised real uncomfortable questions about consent and dignity in those images, questions That almost certainly never crossed the mind of anyone standing in that examination room at the time. Medical photography in this era existed to document and to persuade other doctors of a method's success, not to protect the person being photographed, and a child hanging from straps had essentially no voice in how their own body would be recorded, studied, published in a book, or later reproduced for a room full of strangers on the other side of the ocean. That's not a detail I include to shock you, by the way. I include it because I think it says something quietly important about the whole story tonight, and honestly about most of the stories in this series. The people being treated were rarely the ones holding the pen, the camera, or the plaster bandage. I don't think this makes Sayre a villain in this story, and I would push back gently on anyone eager to paint him as one purely with the comfort of hindsight. He clearly believed with total sincerity that he was helping these children, and in a number of documented cases his patients did seem to noticeably improve at least for a while. But sincerity and correctness are not the same thing, and modern orthopedic doctors looking back at his results with far better tools than he ever had access to remain doubtful that the plaster jacket permanently altered the underlying disease process in most of these children at all. It likely offered real comfort, real support and meaningful short-term relief. Whether it offered anything resembling a lasting cure is a much harder question. One Sayre himself was never fully able to answer, with the evidence available to him, no matter how confidently he wrote about it in his own book. What Sayre's suspension method did leave behind, whatever its flaws, was a genuine foundation. The basic principle underneath it, gentle traction combined with a rigid custom-molded support, still quietly shapes how orthopedic doctors build casts and braces for spinal conditions today more than a century later, even though almost nobody hanging a modern patient by a harness would ever call it a Sayre jacket anymore. In a strange way, that might be the most honest kind of legacy a flawed pioneer can leave behind. Not a perfect cure that history simply adopted wholesale, but a rough, sometimes uncomfortable first attempt that better trained hands working generations later were finally able to refine into something safer. Would you have let a doctor suspend your own child from the ceiling on nothing more than his own confidence that it would help, and a single measured inch to prove it? Sayre's story at its heart is really about the particular kind of trust a small, silent, deeply vulnerable patient has no real choice but to place in the adults standing around them, adults who are at their very best, doing their sincere best with the incomplete tools of their own moment in history. That same uneven balance of trust and vulnerability was about to appear again in an entirely different building under entirely different circumstances. This time, not around a single child suspended from a rope, but around every single patient lying inside an entire hospital ward, and the surprisingly stubborn argument already hinted at earlier tonight over whether the windows above their beds should ever be allowed to open at all. In November of 1854, a woman stepped off a ship at a military hospital called Scutari across the water from Constantinople and found something considerably worse than wounded soldiers waiting for her. She found rats moving freely under the beds. She found a single working toilet trying to serve roughly 2,000 men. She found overflowing sewage sitting in open channels near the wards and not far from where wounded men were laid out to recover the rotting carcass of a dead horse that nobody had bothered to move. The air itself, by nearly every surviving account, was almost unbreathable. Her name, of course, was Florence Nightingale, and if you have ever heard of her at all, you probably picture her the same way most people do. A gentle figure walking hospital corridors by candlelight, tending quietly to wounded men through the night, the famous lady with the lamp. That image is real, and it is touching, and it is also honestly a fairly small piece of a much stranger, much more interesting story than the one usually told about her. Before any of that, Nightingale was simply a wealthy young woman from a comfortable English family raised for a life of drawing rooms, needlework, and an eventual respectable marriage. Nursing in her era carried almost none of the respect it holds today. It was widely considered rough, disreputable work unsuitable for a woman of her class, closer in the public imagination to domestic service than to anything resembling a calling. Her own parents were by every account deeply unhappy with her choice. She pursued formal nursing training anyway, travelling to Germany in 1851, against her family's open disapproval years before the Crimean War ever gave her the chance to prove exactly why that training mattered. Here's the part that tends to surprise people most, and I think it's worth sitting with rather than skipping past on the way to the triumphant ending. During Nightingale's very first winter at Scutari, conditions did not improve. They got worse. More than 4,000 soldiers died in that hospital over those first few months, roughly 10 times as many from disease, typhus, cholera, dysentery, as from the wounds that had actually brought them there in the first place. By February of 1855, the death rate inside the hospital had climbed to somewhere around 42 out of every 100 patients. Would you have expected that number to be dropping, not rising, with Florence Nightingale herself standing right there in the building? Nightingale, like almost every doctor of her era, believed in miasma theory, the idea that disease travelled through foul-smelling air, rather than through anything you could touch or drink. Standing inside a hospital that, unknown to her, had actually been built directly on top of a leaking cesspool, with sewage seeping straight into the water supply. The patients were drinking. She initially blamed the soaring death toll on poor nutrition and general exhaustion among the men. She was doing everything she personally knew how to do, and it was by itself nowhere near enough. Word of the disaster reached London anyway through newspaper reporters who had, for the first time in British history, been allowed to send detailed accounts directly from a war zone back to readers at home. The public was horrified reading over breakfast about British soldiers dying by the thousand in a hospital, rather than on any battlefield. Under mounting pressure, the government finally dispatched an independent group called the Sanitary Commission, which arrived at Scutari in March of 1855, months after Nightingale herself had already been there struggling against conditions she did not yet fully understand. The Commission's engineers found exactly what had been quietly killing the hospital's patients all along. They flushed out the blocked sewers. They cleared the cesspool sitting beneath the building's own foundation. They removed that decomposing horse from beside the water supply and scrubbed the walls with fresh whitewash from top to bottom. Within a matter of months, the mortality rate at Scutari fell from somewhere around 42 out of every 100 patients down to roughly 2. That is not a typo, and it is not an exaggeration. A team of sanitary engineers armed with shovels, lime, and a willingness to finally deal honestly with human waste appears to have saved more lives at that hospital in a few short months than any single act of nursing care could have managed alone. Now, I want to be careful here because this part of the story gets argued over even today, and I don't think either extreme version of it is fully honest. Some modern historians and documentary makers have leaned hard into this discovery, framing it almost as proof that the whole Lady with the Lamp legend was built on a myth, a kind and photogenic figurehead, credited for work that engineers with shovels actually accomplished. Other respected Nightingale scholars push back firmly against that framing, pointing out that Nightingale herself had already been writing furious letters to military officials for months before the commission ever arrived, describing exactly this kind of neglect, and specifically demanding the hospital finally be, in her own words, properly drained and ventilated. She may not have understood the precise mechanism of what was killing her patients, but she was by the surviving evidence already pointing directly at the crime scene, long before the investigators with the right expertise finally showed up to confirm it. I think both things can be true at once, and honestly I find that version of the story far more compelling than either the flattering myth or the debunking backlash against it. Nightingale was not infallible. She was also not simply a passive symbol standing in a hallway holding a lamp. She was a stubborn, furious, occasionally wrong woman who watched thousands of men die in front of her, got the immediate cause wrong at first, and then spent the rest of her entire life making absolutely certain nobody would ever have the chance to make that same mistake again. Because here is where tonight's story actually turns toward its real subject. Nightingale came home from the Crimean War utterly transformed not primarily by what she had healed, but by what she had failed to prevent in time. And rather than simply grieving that failure, she did something almost nobody expected from a woman of her social class in her era. She became functionally one of the most important statisticians in British history, working alongside a well-known writer and social reformer named Harriet Martineau Nightingale, developed a striking new way of presenting mortality data, a colourful wedge-shaped diagram, now often called a rose diagram, that laid out at a single glance exactly how many soldiers had died from preventable disease compared to how many had died from actual combat wounds. Politicians and army officials who had shown little patience for pages of dense statistical tables could look at one of these diagrams for a few seconds and immediately understand the full scale of the disaster, the wedge representing disease towering enormously over the small sliver representing battle wounds. It remains to this day considered one of the earliest and most effective examples of data visualization used specifically to drive real political change, decades before the term data visualization even existed as a phrase anyone would have recognized. Would raw numbers on a page have convinced anyone in power the way that one striking picture clearly did? It is worth pausing on just how unusual this made her for a woman of her era. Nightingale was eventually elected the first female member of the Royal Statistical Society, an organisation built almost entirely around serious men in serious rooms debating serious numbers. She was not simply a caretaker with a kind bedside manner. She was by any fair modern definition a rigorous scientist who happened to be working in nursing at a moment in history when almost nobody expected a woman to be either. Nightingale used that same evidence and that same hard-won fury to attack a much bigger target than any single hospital. She spent years afterwards studying hospital design itself, publishing a detailed book in 1863 called Notes on Hospitals, and in it she laid out with almost engineering-level precision exactly how a hospital ward ought to be built if you actually wanted your patients to survive their treatment rather than simply catch something new while recovering. Her core design became known as the pavilion ward, and the basic idea was almost stubbornly simple. Long rectangular buildings kept relatively low with tall windows running down both sides at regular intervals, positioned so that air could move freely straight through the room from one side to the other. She specified almost everything down to the smallest practical detail, roughly 30 patients to a single ward, ceilings around 16 or 17 feet high, to keep the air from feeling stagnant, beds spaced generously apart rather than crammed together, and buildings oriented so that direct sunlight would sweep across the beds at some point during nearly every single day. Ideally facing east and west so no ward sat in permanent shadow. Separate pavilions rather than one enormous shared hall meant that if one ward developed an outbreak of some kind, it would not automatically spread straight through the entire hospital, an idea that feels almost obvious now and was, at the time, a genuine departure from how most hospitals has been built for centuries. When St Thomas's Hospital in London was rebuilt according to her specifications in the early 1870s, the design became so influential that hospitals across Europe, and eventually well beyond it, began copying it almost wholesale, block after block of long sunlit wards replacing the dark, cramped, overcrowded halls that had come before. To this day, architects and historians still refer to that basic long sunlit cross-ventilated hospital layout simply as a Nightingale ward. Here's the detail that ties this whole story directly back to what I promised you a little earlier tonight. Nightingale never abandoned miasma theory. She died in 1910 still believing at least in part that foul air itself carried disease decades after Pasteur and Koch had already proven the existence of actual bacteria. And yet her pavilion wards built entirely around flushing out bad-smelling air, and flooding a room with sunlight turned out to work extraordinarily well anyway for reasons she never fully understood herself. Sunlight, it turns out, does kill a wide range of bacteria given enough exposure. Fresh circulating air does dilute and disperse airborne infectious particles between one patient's bed and the next. She built the right hospital for entirely the wrong stated reason, using nothing more than careful observation and a refusal to ever again stand quietly by while men died of something preventable. I promised you earlier during a different story tonight that there was a hospital somewhere fighting the opposite battle over its own windows, insisting they stay open rather than sealed shut. This is that hospital. While frightened families elsewhere kept their bedroom windows shut tight, against the night convinced the moving air itself might kill them, Nightingale was standing in a British hospital, insisting that exact same air, allowed to move freely through a sunlit ward, was the very thing standing between her patients and a slow, preventable death. Both instincts came from the same flawed theory of disease. Only one of them happened to be aimed at an environment that actually needed the windows thrown open. We are still, whether we realize it or not, living inside her argument. Modern hospital architects now speak of something called evidence-based design, and controlled studies conducted well over a century after Nightingale's death confirm what she suspected from instinct alone, that patients housed in rooms with real daylight tend to heal faster, request less pain medication, and even in some studies face a measurably lower risk of picking up an infection they did not walk in with. Some hospitals today are once again being designed with courtyards' generous windows and views of greenery principles that had actually fallen out of fashion for several decades in the middle of the 20th century, when architects favoured sealed, artificially lit buildings run entirely on mechanical air systems, before research eventually pulled hospital design back toward the very same instincts Nightingale had already written down in careful, exhausting detail more than 100 years earlier. The next time you find yourself in a hospital room with a large window facing outward, you're standing inside an idea a furious, grieving nurse first sketched out in a memoir following her own worst failure, not her greatest triumph. And that, to me, might be the part of her story most worth carrying with you. It was not her success at Scutari that changed medicine forever. It was a refusal to simply move on from her own failure there. There's one more detail worth knowing before we leave her behind tonight. Nightingale came home from the Crimea chronically unwell, likely carrying some lingering infection picked up in that very same hospital she had spent months trying to save, and she spent much of the rest of her long life largely confined to her bed, rarely seen in public again. And yet from that same bed writing letter after letter, she kept advising government commissions, kept pressuring architects, kept arguing with officials who outranked her in every formal sense for decades. The woman who eventually reshaped hospital design across the world did most of that reshaping without ever fully leaving her own bedroom again, and her instinct that something invisible could quietly determine whether a patient lived or died was about to be proven correct in an entirely different setting, over an entirely different kind of danger, one you could not smell, could not see drifting through any window, and unlike a hospital ward could be bought without a single question asked sitting in an ordinary jar on an ordinary shelf in almost any shop in the country. Picture walking into an ordinary shop in England somewhere around 1840 and asking the person behind the counter for a small paper packet of something you needed to deal with the rats in your kitchen. No questions asked, no signature required, no record kept anywhere that you'd ever set foot in that shop at all. The clerk simply weighed out the powder onto a small brass scale, folded it into a twist of paper, and took your coin the exact same unremarkable way he might have sold you flour or sugar or salt. The powder he handed you was arsenic, and at that point in history it was one of the easier substances in the entire country to buy, colourless, odourless, almost tasteless when mixed into food or drink, cheap enough that a farm labourer could afford it without a second thought, and useful enough that hardly any household in the country would have questioned why you wanted some. It killed rats. It killed the parasites plaguing a farmer's sheep. It went into a striking, fashionable shade of green pigment, used to colour wallpaper and fabric, found in countless Victorian drawing rooms, without a single resident realising what exactly was flaking gently off their own walls year after year. It sat inside more remedies sold by travelling apothecaries than anyone bothered to count promoted as a treatment for everything from skin complaints to a pale, fashionable complexion. Small tablets some young women reportedly swallowed deliberately believing a hint of arsenic in the blood produced exactly the delicate, luminous pallor high society considered beautiful at the time. And as it turned out, arsenic did something else almost as efficiently as it killed vermin-brightened wallpaper or cleared a rash. It killed people, and for a disturbingly long stretch of the century it very often got away with it completely. Here's a small detail that tells you everything about how deeply this substance had worked its way into ordinary British life. During a parliamentary debate on the subject, one lawmaker noted almost in passing that among certain communities where poisoning cases kept turning up, people had started using the very word arsenic as a stand-in for the word poison itself, the way you might casually say tissue when you actually mean any brand of it. That is not the kind of linguistic habit that develops around a rare exotic substance locked away behind careful supervision. That is what happens when something sits unguarded on nearly every counter in the country. Would you have thought twice about keeping a jar of something that dangerous in your own kitchen cupboard right next to the sugar? Doctors of the era struggled with arsenic poisoning for another deeply uncomfortable reason. The early symptoms, violent stomach cramps, vomiting, diarrhea, general weakness looked almost identical to a dozen ordinary illnesses already sweeping through Victorian Britain on a regular basis, cholera chief among them. A quiet, gradual poisoning administered in small doses over weeks, rather than a single fatal spoonful, could pass entirely unnoticed, mistaken for a stomach complaint or a seasonal fever right up until it was far too late to matter, and sometimes not even then. For anyone patient enough and cold-blooded enough to use it slowly, arsenic offered something bordering on the perfect crime, easily explained away by a grieving family with no reason to suspect foul play in the first place, at least until chemistry finally caught up with it. By 1851, public alarm over both accidental poisonings and deliberate ones had grown loud enough that Parliament finally acted. The result was the Arsenic Act and its actual rules. Once you look closely at them, tell you a great deal about exactly what lawmakers were afraid of. Every single sale now had to be written down in a register, the date, the buyer's name and address, the stated purpose, the exact quantity signed by both the person selling it and the person buying it. If the seller did not personally know the buyer, an independent witness known to both parties had to be present for the transaction. Arsenic could only be sold to adults. and unless it was being sold for a specific medical or agricultural use that required it to stay white cellars, were now required to mix it with a visible colouring agent, either soot or a blue dye called indigo, specifically so nobody could mistake it even for a moment for flour sugar or any other harmless white powder sitting on a nearby shelf. Lawmakers at the time were mostly picturing a very specific kind of villain when they drafted these rules, a quiet poisoner slipping something fatal into a spouse's dinner or a rival's tea, someone deliberate and calculating enough that a signed register, a witness, and a suspicious question or two at the counter might actually give them pause before committing to murder. And in fairness, that fear was not paranoia. Poisoning trials involving arsenic turn up again and again in the criminal records of this exact period, enough that newspapers of the era covered them, almost as a recurring feature complete with expert witnesses testifying about newly developed chemical tests capable of detecting the poison in a body long after death. The register, imperfect as it was, did make that particular kind of murder measurably harder to commit and get away with clean. That last requirement, dyeing the poison a visible colour, is worth sitting with for a moment because it is such a strikingly simple, almost obvious idea. And it is also the exact detail that makes what happened in a city called Bradford just 7 years later so difficult to fully accept. In October of 1858, a confectioner named Joseph Neal needed to prepare a fresh batch of peppermint humbugs for one of his regular customers, a market trader nicknamed Humbug Billy, whose real name was William Hardaker. Sugar at the time was expensive, so like many sweetmakers of the era, Neal routinely stretched his mixture using a cheap bulking agent nicknamed Daff, a harmless combination of plaster of Paris powdered limestone and gypsum. He sent a young lodger to collect the usual supply of Daff from a local druggist's shop several miles away in a town called Shipley. The druggist himself was too unwell to serve the customer that day, so the errand was handled instead by his assistant, a young man with barely 3 weeks of experience working in a pharmacy. Reaching for what he believed was the usual sack of Daff, stored carelessly in the same corner of the same attic, he instead measured out 12 pounds of arsenic trioxide and sold it entirely by mistake as the harmless bulking powder Neal had ordered. Nobody caught the error. The experienced sweetmaker who mixed the batch, a man named James Appleton, did notice. The finished humbugs looked slightly darker than usual and felt strangely unwell himself. For days afterward, his hands aching his stomach in knots, but assumed he had simply picked up a passing stomach bug. Hardaker, receiving the sweets at his stall, noticed the same odd darker colour, haggled the price down slightly to account for it, and sold them anyway. Would you have trusted your own instinct enough to refuse a shipment that simply looked a little off? Or would you have talked yourself out of the suspicion the same way they did? That Saturday night, roughly 5 pounds of the tainted humbugs went out to unsuspecting customers across Bradford. By the next morning, 2 young children were already dead. Authorities first suspected cholera, a disease still terrifyingly common in British cities at the time, until the death toll kept climbing through households that had no other connection to one another, except a shared visit to the same market stall. A local bellman reportedly spent that night and the following day walking through the streets, ringing his bell and shouting warnings about the poisoned sweets, an old-fashioned kind of emergency broadcast that likely saved a considerable number of lives before word could spread any other way. By the time the true scale of the disaster became clear, somewhere around 20 people, including several young children, one reportedly barely a year and a half old, had died, and more than 200 others had fallen seriously ill. A later chemical analysis found that a single one of those peppermint humbugs contained enough concentrated arsenic to kill 2 grown adults outright. Here is the detail that makes this story sit so uneasily alongside the law you just heard about a few minutes ago. The druggist, his young assistant, and the confectioner were all formally charged over the deaths. And in December of that same year, all 3 men walked out of court acquitted because prosecutors ultimately could not prove that any of them had technically broken an existing law. Think about that for a moment. Britain already had a law passed 7 years earlier specifically designed to stop exactly this kind of tragedy, requiring poison to be dyed a visible colour, precisely so it could never again be mistaken for an innocent white powder like flour or sugar. And it still happened anyway because the 1851 law only governed arsenic sold directly as arsenic for a stated purpose, written into a register signed by 2 people who both understood what they were buying and selling. It said nothing at all about how a shop was required to store that same poison once it sat on the shelf safely tucked away from every other unlabelled white powder nearby. The law had shut one very specific door with real care and real intention, and completely forgotten to check whether the window right beside it had ever been latched at all. I think that gap tells us something a little bigger than just one unlucky mix-up in a Yorkshire attic. Lawmakers then and now tend to write rules narrowly focused on the exact tragedy sitting freshly in front of them, the deliberate poisoner slipping something into a rival's tea, rather than the much duller, much more common danger of 2 nearly identical sacks of white powder stored carelessly beside one another by an exhausted, undertrained assistant covering for his sick employer. Deliberate murder makes for a gripping headline the kind Parliament can debate passionately for weeks. Careless storage rarely does right up until the moment it kills 20 people in a single weekend, and even then the courtroom outcome can still somehow end in 3 men walking free, because the specific mistake that killed those people was never technically written down as a crime at all. That is, I think, one of the quieter lessons buried inside this whole story. A law is only ever as good as the specific failure its authors happen to imagine while writing it. Every disaster it never anticipated simply waits patiently outside its reach until it eventually happens anyway and forces somebody to write the next law after it. Bradford's tragedy did eventually push British law further than the 1851 Act had gone. A decade later, the Pharmacy Act of 1868 expanded the entire framework considerably formally, naming 15 specific poisons that now required careful regulation well beyond arsenic alone, and mandating that dangerous substances be sold in distinctly shaped textured glass bottles, ribbed or fluted in a way that even someone reaching for a bottle in complete darkness could feel the difference under their own fingers before ever pouring a drop. The Act also finally required professional pharmacists, rather than any grocer or general shopkeeper, willing to stock a jar of powder to be the ones handling the most dangerous substances at all. That single detail, the ribbed glass, has always stuck with me. Regulators had learned the hard way that visible colour alone was not enough protection. If the danger might ever be encountered in a dim room in a rush by an exhausted assistant working late into the evening, the safeguard needed to work by touch as well as by sight. The poison register born from all of this outlived the Victorian era by a remarkably long stretch. Those signed ledgers listing ordinary names beside ordinary purposes, quietly rat poison weed killer sheep dip became such a familiar fixture of British pharmacy life that they eventually worked their way into popular fiction itself. The novelist Agatha Christie, who worked for a time as a pharmacy dispenser during the First World War, encountered exactly this kind of poison register first-hand. Decades after the original 1851 Act, watching ordinary customers sign their names beside ordinary reasons for wanting something capable of killing a person. She later drew directly on that first-hand experience for the countless poisonings scattered throughout her famous mystery novels, imagining chapter after chapter exactly the kind of quiet, patient killer that Parliament had been trying to stop with a signature and a witness back in 1851. A piece of tedious Victorian paperwork born out of real bodies and real grief in places like Bradford eventually became one of the quiet engines behind an entire genre of fiction millions of people still enjoy purely for entertainment today, and in a strange way that register still exists today, just wearing a different name. Modern pharmacies keep detailed logs of controlled substances for precisely the same reason a Victorian chemist once had to record your name before selling you rat poison, because a written record, plain and unglamorous as it might seem sitting in a drawer, remains one of the simplest tools we have ever invented for making sure a dangerous substance can always eventually be traced back to a specific hand, which raises an uncomfortable question worth carrying with you as we move on tonight. If a poison capable of killing an entire family could once sit unlabeled and unguarded on an ordinary shop counter beside the sugar and the flour, what else hiding in plain sight on that very same counter wasn't quite what it claimed to be either. Sit down at an ordinary breakfast table in London sometime around 1850 and look at what's really in front of you. A slice of bread, pale and soft, still warm from the baker down the street. A cup of tea, dark and fragrant steam curling up toward the ceiling. A splash of milk poured over it, delivered fresh that same morning by a churn cart working its way down the road. Nothing here looks the least bit suspicious. It looks in fact like an entirely ordinary breakfast, the kind millions of families across the city were sitting down to at that exact same hour. Now let me tell you what a patient obsessive doctor with a microscope truly found hiding inside food exactly like this sold across the city at the time, and I promise you, it is considerably stranger than anything sitting on a poisoner's shelf. That bread, the pale, appealing kind everyone wanted, was very often whitened with alum and chalk, sometimes bulked out further with plaster of Paris powdered limestone, even sawdust, whatever a baker could mix in cheaply, to stretch a loaf further and make it look whiter and so finer to a customer who associated pale bread with wealth and dark, coarse bread with poverty. That milk had frequently been watered down and topped up with a little chalk to disguise the thinner colour underneath. And that tea, the dark, fragrant cup steaming gently in front of you had, in a disturbing number of documented cases, already been used once, already by somebody else dried out, then restored to something resembling fresh tea leaves, by boiling it in a mixture that reportedly in some cases included ferrous sulfate and almost unbelievably sheep manure, before being dyed back to an appealing dark colour with chemical colorants that had absolutely no business anywhere near a teacup. Would you have finished that cup knowing exactly what restored its colour? Here's the thing worth sitting with before we go any further tonight. None of this was some rare, isolated scandal involving one crooked grocer on one unlucky street. This was, by the best estimates of the era, nearer to the ordinary condition of food itself in Victorian Britain. A public lecture delivered in 1861 by a well-regarded doctor claimed that roughly 87 out of every 100 loaves of bread tested in London and around 74 out of every 100 samples of milk showed clear signs of adulteration. Beer sometimes carried a dose of strychnine, the same substance used elsewhere as rat poison, added specifically to create a sharper, more bitter taste, without paying for the actual hops that bitterness was supposed to come from. Some publicans reportedly went even further, adding a pinch of ordinary salt to a customer's drink, purely because a saltier beer left a man thirstier, and a thirstier man simply ordered another round sooner than he otherwise would have. Parliament eventually had to pass a separate licensing law, specifically banning that particular trick, a small, almost comic detail sitting alongside everything else proof that Victorian tradesmen were willing to manipulate a customer's own body chemistry if it meant selling one more round before the tavern shut its doors for the night. Butter and gin both turned up laced with copper, added purely to brighten their colour into something more appealing on a counter, and a later government survey found copper contamination in roughly 1 out of every 10 samples of butter tested, and in half of all the gin. Sweets of all things sometimes carried a colouring agent containing a heavy metal we now know causes serious lasting harm to a developing child's nervous system, mixed in purely so a candy might look a shade brighter sitting in a shop window. If you ate or drank almost anything in London during this period, you were very likely getting more than you had actually paid for, and considerably less than you actually deserved. Would you have trusted your own eyes and your own taste buds to catch any of that standing at a grocer's counter, with no way to see beneath the surface of anything you bought? So how did anyone finally catch it? That part of the story belongs almost entirely to one deeply stubborn, quietly furious man. His name was Arthur Hill Hassall, and his path toward exposing all of this began almost by accident. Trained as a physician in Dublin under his own uncle before moving to London, Hassall had already made a name for himself in his 20s, writing one of the very first English textbooks on the microscopic structure of the human body, illustrated with his own detailed drawings of tissue most doctors of the era had never before seen magnified in any real detail. But poor health, a recurring theme in his own private letters, eventually forced him to abandon regular medical practice altogether. Rather than step away from science entirely, he turned his attention and that same relentless microscope toward analytical chemistry, instead quietly building a reputation as one of the most careful, most patient observers working in London medicine. A paper he wrote about adulteration in coffee of all things caught the attention of Thomas Wackley, the fiery editor of a respected medical journal called The Lancet, who had already been dreaming up an ambitious project of his own, a full-scale scientific investigation into exactly what was being sold as food across the city. Wackley put Hassall in charge of the entire operation, and Hassall over the following several years examined something approaching 2,500 separate samples of food, drink and tobacco. One painstaking analysis at a time, publishing his findings week after week in the pages of The Lancet for the public to study for themselves. His method had a wonderfully theatrical streak running underneath all that scientific rigour. Rather than simply announcing in the abstract that adulteration existed somewhere out there in the city, Hassall or his trusted agents personally purchased ordinary samples from ordinary shops, the same way any regular customer would, walking in asking for a pound of tea or a loaf of bread, paying with an ordinary coin, and walking back out again without a single shopkeeper suspecting anything out of the ordinary had just happened. One admiring account from the period compared him to a storybook caliph, wandering his own city in disguise, gathering the honest truth nobody would ever willingly hand over to an obvious inspector standing in the doorway with a notebook. Back in his own rooms, every sample went straight under the microscope, and where chemistry alone could settle a question the microscope could not, he brought in a trusted chemist colleague to confirm it. Once the evidence held up, Hassall published the specific name and address of the shop the sample had come from, right there in the report, alongside a detailed illustration of exactly what his lens had revealed for every reader of The Lancet to see for themselves. Over the entire course of the investigation, only one shopkeeper ever seriously threatened to sue him over it, and that single threat quietly evaporated once it became clear just how carefully documented Hassall's evidence actually was. For a man publicly accusing hundreds of London tradesmen of fraud in a widely circulated journal, that is a remarkably clean legal record, and it tells you a great deal about just how rigorous his methods really were. Would you have wanted your own shop's name printed in a medical journal right next to a detailed drawing of exactly what your bread actually contained? That single decision naming names rather than simply denouncing an abstract faceless problem is in my opinion the real reason this particular investigation changed anything at all. General outrage aimed at grocers as a whole had never forced a single grocer to improve a single loaf. A specific published accusation against one named shop on one named street, backed by a detailed microscopic illustration any reader could examine for themselves, was an entirely different kind of pressure, altogether one aimed squarely at a real business with a real reputation actually at stake. The public reaction, once his findings were gathered together into a single published book in 1855, was somewhere between fascination and horror. One especially memorable entry described a sample of tea purchased from an entirely ordinary shop that turned out under the microscope to contain a striking proportion of leaves that had by every visible sign already been brewed and dried out once before, then chemically recoloured to look freshly picked again. Readers who had never given a second thought to what filled their own teapot suddenly found themselves staring at detailed illustrations of exactly that question answered in uncomfortable magnified detail. Newspapers of the period described the deep and general unease his disclosures produced across the city, and the Times eventually credited him almost single-handedly with dragging the entire scandal into daylight. That praise, predictably enough, did not sit well with everyone involved in the project. A bitter argument broke out afterward in the letters pages of several journals, some insisting the real credit belonged to Whately for having the vision to commission the investigation in the first place, or to other organisers who had helped publicise the results rather than to Hassel alone. Reading through those old letters now, you can practically feel the wounded professional pride radiating off the page. Grown men arguing in print over which one of them truly deserved the applause for a project that had by any reasonable measure taken every one of them working together to succeed. It is honestly a familiar enough pattern by this point in tonight's story. Real reform rarely traces back to one single hero, acting entirely alone no matter how satisfying that version might be to tell. It usually takes a patient investigator willing to do the unglamorous repetitive work, and someone else with a large enough platform willing to make sure the rest of the country actually had to look at what that work found. Parliament, under mounting public pressure, finally passed the Adulteration of Food and Drugs Act in 1860. Here's the disappointing part, and by now you may be noticing a pattern in tonight's episode as a whole. That first law had almost no real teeth. It left enforcement mostly voluntary, handed local authorities the option to appoint inspectors rather than any requirement to do so, and offered so little real incentive to prosecute that one contemporary review of the law's early results described its practical effect quite bluntly as doing next to nothing at all. Shopkeepers who had already been caught and named by Hassel himself continued selling adulterated goods for years. Afterward, since being publicly embarrassed in a medical journal, it turned out carried no actual legal weight whatsoever. A revised version followed in 1872, tightening a few loose ends and giving inspectors slightly more authority to act on their own. It was not until the Sale of Food and Drugs Act of 1875 that Britain finally had a law with genuine enforcement power behind it, one that still forms the basic foundation of food safety regulation in the country. Today, a full 20 years after Hassel first started publishing his uncomfortable little drawings of what was actually hiding inside a loaf of bread, would 20 years have felt like an unreasonable wait to you, knowing exactly what was already sitting on your own table the entire time? I keep noticing something as we move through these stories together tonight, and I think it's worth naming out loud. So many of the real turning points we've covered were not won by force, or by violence, or even really by outrage all on its own. They were won by somebody patient enough to measure, to document, to draw exactly what they saw under a microscope, or count exactly how many people died in one ward instead of another, and then refused to stop repeating that same uncomfortable fact until somebody finally had to act on it. A hospital ward redesigned around sunlight, a death rate finally understood as a wedge-shaped diagram, a poison register signed in triplicate, and now a slice of ordinary bread quietly proven sample after sample to be something considerably less than what it claimed to be. None of these people carried a weapon of any kind. Their most dangerous tool every single time was simply the willingness to look closely enough and long enough that the problem could no longer be politely ignored. We still exist inside the world Hassel's stubbornness helped build. Every ingredient label you glance at in a grocery store, every food safety inspection, a restaurant quietly passes or fails, every government laboratory testing a batch of imported produce right now while you listen to this, traces its lineage directly back to a Victorian doctor with failing health and a very good microscope who decided that the only way to fix a problem this widespread was to look at it closely enough, sample by sample, shop by shop, that nobody could credibly pretend it wasn't there anymore. And if a slice of ordinary bread could hide something that unsettling from an entire city for decades sitting in plain sight on every single breakfast table in London, you might reasonably start wondering what else Victorian society had been quietly hiding in plain sight. Not on a dinner plate this time. Behind the locked doors of buildings, most people crossed the street to avoid even looking at directly where an entirely different kind of examination decided, often with far less evidence than Hassel ever demanded of a single loaf of bread, whether a person deserved to be treated as a patient or simply locked away and forgotten. In December of 1830, a 27-year-old former army officer named John Percival began behaving in ways his friends and family could no longer explain away. His speech grew strange. His thoughts, by his own later account, seemed to arrive from somewhere outside his own control entirely. Voices and convictions he could not simply reason his way out of no matter how hard he tried. His friends restrained him. His eldest brother crossed the water to bring him home, and soon afterward his own mother, now legally his guardian under the laws of the time, signed the paperwork that placed him inside a private asylum, the first of two he would spend the better part of 3 years locked inside with almost no say of his own in when or whether he might ever come back out. Percival was not an ordinary patient in one particular sense. His father had been Spencer. Percival, the only British Prime Minister ever assassinated, shot dead in the lobby of the House of Commons in 1812. Parliament, in the aftermath of that killing, had voted the grieving family a payment of more than £50,000. Nearly 2 decades later, that same money was quietly funding his own confinement in 2 of the most expensive private asylums money could buy. At the first of them, a house called Brislington near Bristol, Percival later wrote that his treatment had been brutal, degrading in ways he clearly still struggled to describe even years afterward. At the second, a place called Ticehurst in Sussex, the regime was considerably more humane, gentler, better staffed. And yet even there his eventual release was delayed, and delayed again well past the point where he believed himself entirely recovered. Would you have trusted your own family to know exactly when you were well enough to come home if the law gave them almost total authority over that decision either way? To understand why Percival's story eventually mattered to an entire country, you first need to understand just how little legal protection existed for anyone labelled insane in Britain before the 1840s. Private madhouses varied wildly in quality, some run with genuine care, others little more than profitable warehouses for inconvenient relatives, wealthy enough to pay handsomely for a family member's permanent quiet removal from polite society. A troublesome wife, an embarrassing son, an heir whose inheritance somebody else preferred to control. None of these situations required anything near the level of proof we would expect today, before somebody could be locked away sometimes for years, sometimes for the remainder of an entire life. A handful of doctors' signatures, occasionally purchased with little more scrutiny than the fee itself, were often all it took to make a person legally disappear from ordinary society with barely a trace left in any public record, and the proprietor of a private madhouse paid handsomely for every bed kept full had every financial incentive in the world to accept that paperwork without asking too many uncomfortable questions of his own. This was not, by the way, an entirely new problem in Percival's era. Decades earlier, in 1790, a Quaker woman named Hannah Mills died inside York's public asylum only weeks after her admission, under conditions so troubling that her own friends had been refused permission to visit her beforehand, told simply that she was receiving private treatment and needed no visitors at all. The local Quaker community, horrified once they finally learned the truth, asked a tea and coffee merchant named William Tuke to help build something better. What Tuke created, opening in 1796 and calling it simply The Retreat, banned chains, banned physical punishment entirely, and treated its residents with a level of dignity almost nobody else in the field considered practical at the time. Private rooms, useful daily occupation, quiet conversation over shared meals, gardens to walk through, rather than bare cells to sit inside, and a belief radical for its era that a disturbed mind could actually recover given patience and respect rather than restraint and fear. Tuke himself reportedly felt so isolated in the early years of this project that he once remarked with real weariness that all his acquaintances seemed to have deserted him over the idea. Word of his methods eventually crossed the water and influenced reformers as far away as Paris, and the approach earned its own name, moral treatment, a phrase that would echo through English mental health law for the rest of the century. By 1845, that philosophy and decades of scattered outrage over cases exactly like Percival's finally reached Parliament in the form of two linked pieces of legislation, the Lunacy Act and the County Asylums Act. Together they changed something surprisingly fundamental about how the law itself talked about people like Percival. For the first time, English law formally began referring to them as patients, rather than the older, harsher language that had effectively treated them as something nearer to prisoners or property. Counties were now legally required, not simply encouraged, to build proper public asylums for anyone who needed one ending decades of patchy voluntary provision that had left entire regions of the country with nowhere safe to send someone in crisis. And a newly formed body called the Lunacy Commission was given real authority to inspect asylums across the country, public and private alike, sending commissioners unannounced into wards, reviewing patient records and interviewing residents directly, specifically, hunting for exactly the kind of unchecked abuse and wrongful confinement Percival himself had just survived. Their inspection power mattered more than it might sound. Commissioners had the authority to examine restraint records, question staff privately away from any supervisor, and speak directly with patients themselves, checking whether the reasons given for someone's continued confinement still held up against the person actually standing in front of them. Bethlehem Hospital in London, the notorious institution whose very name eventually gave the English language the word Bedlam, had actually been exempt from outside inspection for years, protected by its status as a charitable institution rather than a public asylum. It took years of pressure and eventually a formal complaint the society itself helped bring forward before the commissioners were finally permitted inside to investigate conditions there directly, and what they found led to real documented reforms once their critical report became public in 1852. Here's where Percival's story becomes truly remarkable rather than simply sad. He did not quietly disappear back into ordinary life once he was finally released. He wrote publishing a detailed account of his own experience inside those asylum walls, unflinching about the humiliations he had endured, in the hope that putting his suffering into print might spare somebody else the same fate. That account still gets studied today not as some dusty historical curiosity, but as one of the earliest detailed first-person descriptions of what a severe mental health crisis actually feels like, from the inside, written decades before psychiatry had the language or the humility to take a patient's own account of their experience seriously at all. And on the 7th of July 1845, the very same year, Parliament passed those two acts. Percival joined a small group of former patients, worried relatives, and sympathetic reformers to found something called the Alleged Lunatics Friend Society. He became its honorary secretary the following year, and stayed in that role for roughly the next 2 decades, eventually describing himself with what I suspect was a very deliberate touch of dark humour as the Attorney General of Her Majesty's Madmen. He even used his position on a local board of guardians to secure himself legal access to inspect asylums, directly walking back through the exact kind of doors that had once been locked firmly behind him, this time entirely by his own choice. Would you have had the strength, after everything Percival survived, to spend the next 20 years of your own life fighting for strangers trapped in exactly the same kind of building? The Society's work was not abstract. They took up real individual cases one after another, each one a small window, into exactly how easily the system could be misused. A woman named Jane Bright from a wealthy Leicestershire family had been seduced by a doctor who took most of her money and left her pregnant only for her own brothers to have her committed once the child was born, apparently finding her disgraced condition more convenient to hide behind a diagnosis than to simply support her through it. A businessman named James Hill, father of the future housing reformer Octavia Hill, was declared bankrupt and confined to an asylum shortly afterward, a case the Society took up specifically because financial ruin in this era could sit dangerously near a diagnosis of madness in the eyes of the wrong doctor, as though losing your money were itself a symptom worth locking somebody away for. And in one case that still reads as almost darkly comic today, a man named Dr. Peathman was committed to an asylum after repeated attempts to personally speak with Prince Albert, a decision that says a great deal about how easily simple persistence, or plain inconvenience to somebody important, could be quietly relabeled as insanity by anyone holding the right signature and the right motive. Would you have trusted a system where losing your fortune, embarrassing your family, or simply refusing to stop asking an inconvenient question could all technically be treated as evidence against your own sanity? The Society campaigned for years through Parliament, through the courts, through public lectures held in ordinary taverns, to whoever would listen, before finally winning a formal parliamentary hearing in 1859, more than a decade after Percival had first begun the fight. In the years leading up to that hearing, the Society reportedly took up a considerable number of separate cases, each one a full investigation, each one requiring letters, visits, and often a direct confrontation with a family or an asylum proprietor who had every financial reason to want the questions to simply stop. Would you have kept knocking on that many doors year after year for people who owed you absolutely nothing in return? Percival himself gave evidence to that select committee in July of that year, arguing for stronger protection against wrongful confinement, real safeguards against invasive treatment, given without consent, and more radically than most of his contemporaries were willing to demand the complete abolition of private asylums, altogether arguing that any system built around a profit motive would always be tempted to fill its beds regardless of genuine need. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say Percival spent the rest of his working life turning his own worst experience into a shield for people he had never met. That is, on reflection, a truly rare kind of response to trauma, and I think it deserves to be said plainly rather than folded quietly into the background of a story mostly remembered for its legislation. Most people who survive something like what happened to him simply want to move on and never look back. Percival instead spent decades walking straight back toward it on purpose for the sake of strangers. But I also don't want to leave you with too tidy a version of this story, because the real ending is considerably messier than a single triumphant reform. The same 1845 law that finally gave patients legal standing also triggered a genuine construction boom in public asylums across the country, growing from just a small handful at the start of the century to nearly 100 separate institutions by the century's end. More beds meant more people funneled into the system, often now with far less individual scrutiny than a case like Percival's wealthy and connected had ever received. Some of the newer county asylums, built quickly and cheaply to satisfy the fresh legal requirement, ended up housing far more patients than they were ever designed to comfortably hold corridors and day rooms crowded well past what Tuke's original small community in York had ever imagined. Even the retreat itself, the gentle model that started this entire movement, eventually grew larger, more medicalized and considerably less personal as the decades wore on, gradually trading some of its founding intimacy for the exact same institutional scale every other asylum around it was chasing. So which mattered more in the end, protecting the truly vulnerable from neglect and cruelty inside these buildings, or protecting ordinary people from ever being pushed through those same doors in the first place on the word of a doctor, a spouse, or an inconvenienced brother? Honestly, 1845 never fully resolved that question, and I am not convinced any single law ever could. It simply built a system sturdy enough to hold both possibilities, at once real care for those who truly needed it, and real risk for anyone whose family for whatever reason preferred them somewhere quiet. And that same uneasy question, who gets to decide what counts as acceptable behaviour, and who pays the price the moment they cross an invisible line somebody else has drawn, did not stay confined to asylum walls. It simply changed clothes and walked back out into the ordinary street outside. Before this century ended an ordinary habit, almost nobody thought twice about something men in particular did, without a second glance from anyone around them, was about to become quite suddenly a punishable offence. A man rides a New York City streetcar sometime around 1910, does something he has done his entire life, without a second thought, something his own father probably did, and his father before him. He clears his throat, leans toward the floor, and spits the exact same small, unremarkable gesture men had been making on city streets for as long as anyone could remember. By the time the car reaches the next stop, he's in handcuffs standing on the platform, while curious passengers step around him to board. His crime: he spat on the floor. That sentence alone probably sounds a little absurd to you, and honestly it sounded absurd to plenty of people living through it too. But by the time that man felt cold metal shut tight around his wrists, this exact scene had already played out more than 2,000 times across the city, and the reason behind it turns out to be one of the most quietly serious stories in tonight's whole collection. To understand why a habit as old and as ordinary as spitting suddenly became a crime, you have to understand what was actually killing people in 19th century cities more than almost anything else. Tuberculosis, often simply called consumption, because of the way it seemed to slowly consume a person from the inside, hollowing out the chest and draining the colour from the skin over months or years, was by a wide margin the single deadliest disease in America and Europe during this period, responsible for something near 1 out of every 7 deaths recorded. It moved through crowded tenement buildings, through factories, through streetcars packed shoulder to shoulder with strangers, and for most of the century nobody could tell you with any real confidence exactly how it travelled from one lung to the next. Some still blamed bad air, others blamed heredity or simply bad luck, Entire families watched members waste away one after another, with no clear explanation for why the disease seemed to move through a household the way it did. That changed in 1882 when a German physician named Robert Koch identified the specific bacterium responsible for the disease under his own microscope, and demonstrated through careful, repeated experiment that it spread primarily through tiny droplets released from an infected person's lungs and throat. It remains one of the single most important discoveries in the entire history of infectious disease, and Koch would later receive a Nobel Prize for it. Suddenly an act so common that almost nobody in a 19th-century city thought twice about it, casually spitting on a sidewalk, a factory floor, or the wooden boards of a streetcar looked completely different under this new understanding. Every dried fleck of infected sputum sitting in the dust of a public floor represented a genuine sustained health risk to every single person who breathed anywhere near it afterward, long after the person who had spat it there had already gone home for the evening. Would you have looked at your own city streets any differently the moment somebody explained exactly what was drying out on the pavement beneath your boots? New York City took that new understanding more seriously and more publicly than almost anywhere else in the country. Under the leadership of a forward-thinking health commissioner named Herman Biggs, the city passed an ordinance in 1896 making it illegal to spit in public places and on public transit, becoming sidewalk staircases and the floors of streetcars, ferries, and elevated trains alike, making New York the very first American city to put such a law formally on the books. Violators faced a fine of $1 to $5, or for anyone who simply refused to pay or kept right on doing it, up to a full year in jail penalties that would have felt truly severe to a working man earning only a handful of dollars a week. Here's a detail I find truly moving, and it rarely gets mentioned when this story gets told. The push behind that law did not come primarily from doctors or from City Hall. It came from a group of middle-class women who called themselves the Ladies' Health Protective Association, working alongside Brooklyn's own local anti-tuberculosis committee. For roughly 6 years, this group lobbied the city's health board relentlessly, wrote letters, organized meetings, testified before officials, who were not always inclined to take a room full of women, especially seriously, and refused to let the issue quietly disappear, the way so many public health campaigns before it already had. Would you have expected the loudest voices demanding this particular law to belong to women who at the time could not even legally cast a vote for the officials they were pressuring? And would you have kept showing up to those same meetings year after year, knowing full well how easily you could be dismissed the moment you walk through the door? At first, enforcement stayed fairly gentle. The city posted signs on streetcars politely reminding riders not to spit, and mostly relied on citizens quietly reminding one another of the new rule, a gentle social pressure more than an actual legal threat. That changed considerably in 1909 when a newly appointed health commissioner decided gentle reminders had run their course. He organized what the city called a sanitary squad officers, assigned specifically to patrol subway platforms and public spaces on certain nights, waiting quietly in the crowd, watching for exactly the small thoughtless gesture almost every man in the station had made 100 times before, without a second thought, then rounding up anyone caught doing it, and hauling them off sometimes in genuine batches to face a magistrate before the night was through. By 1910, the city had logged upward of 2,500 separate arrests under this single ordinance, an extraordinary number for a law punishing something most people had never once considered a punishable act in their entire lives. Not everyone accepted the new rule quietly. Letters to newspapers from this period accused the law of cruelly targeting what one writer bluntly called a natural impulse, curtailing a man's basic personal freedom over his own body in public, as though the government had no business dictating what a citizen did with his own throat on his own morning commute. Some frustrated residents took to deliberately spitting directly onto the very posters, warning them not to a small petty act of protest that still somehow feels instantly familiar, even more than a century later the exact same impulse that makes a modern smoker linger a little too near a no-smoking sign out of pure stubbornness. And there was skepticism from inside the medical profession too. As early as 1886, years before New York's law even existed, one medical journal had already predicted that any law against spitting would only ever be as effective as the average level of enthusiasm shown by the police officer, the judge and the streetcar conductor actually responsible for enforcing it day to day, a warning that turned out to be almost perfectly accurate. I have to admit there is something wonderfully human about that particular prediction. A public health law can be written with the absolute best science available at the time behind it, and still ultimately succeed or fail, based on whether an exhausted police officer at the end of a long shift can be bothered to write up the paperwork. Good science, it turns out, has never once been enough on its own. It always needs somebody tired, underpaid, and only half convinced to actually go out and enforce it. The idea spread with real speed regardless. Within about 15 years of New York's ordinance, something near 150 other American cities had passed some version of the same law, plastering their own streetcars and sidewalks with slogans designed to be blunt enough that nobody could misunderstand the point. One widely used poster stated flatly that spitting was dangerous, indecent, and against the law. Another simply warned residents to beware the careless spitter. It was in its own unglamorous way one of the largest coordinated public health messaging campaigns America had ever seen up to that point, built entirely around convincing millions of ordinary people to break a habit most of them had never once considered, a problem town by town, streetcar by streetcar, poster by poster. And the law's usefulness did not end with tuberculosis. When influenza ripped through the country in 1918 and 1919, killing far more people worldwide than the recently ended war itself, had managed city officials in New York reach straight back for the very same anti-spitting ordinance, arresting offenders all over again under a law originally written for a completely different disease, because the basic underlying danger, invisible droplets passing quietly from one set of lungs to another, turned out to work exactly the same way twice. So did the law actually work? Honestly, the evidence is mixed, and I think that mixed answer is more interesting than a clean victory would have been. Most of the fines handed out were small, often less than $1, and jail sentences remained rare throughout the whole period, exactly as that skeptical doctor had predicted back in 1886. Tuberculosis rates did eventually fall through the early 20th century, but that decline came from a whole tangle of causes working together at once. Better housing, better nutrition, improved general sanitation, and eventually real medical treatment not from the spitting law, standing alone as some kind of miracle cure. What the law did accomplish reliably and immediately was something a little quieter than a cure. It forced an entire nation of ordinary people to think consciously, even for a second, about the invisible consequences of an action they had never once questioned before in their whole lives, and that more than the actual arrest numbers might be the real legacy worth remembering here tonight. Not that the law stamped out tuberculosis single-handedly, because it did not, but that it managed to plant in the mind of an ordinary streetcar rider the entirely new idea that an invisible germ could travel from his own mouth into somebody else's lungs, a concept that simply had not existed in most people's imagination one generation earlier. We have spent this whole night walking through rule after rule that once looked strange harsh, or even a little cruel from a distance. A doctor demanding his own colleagues wash their hands before they would believe him, and paying for that demand with the rest of his sanity. Families sealing their windows shut against air they were sure could kill them, never once suspecting the real danger was waiting outside on tiny wings instead. An entire city building, coffins with bells attached out of pure aching love and fear, and a crowd burning a dead man's likeness in effigy over a needle that had already saved more lives than almost anything else in medical history. A quiet, furious woman turning her own worst failure into the blueprint for how a hospital should let the sunlight in, and a stubborn doctor with a microscope proving that the bread on your own table was not remotely what it claimed to be, a father funding his own son's imprisonment inside a plaster jacket because it was the only hope anyone could offer him, and a man who survived his own asylum spending the next 20 years of his life fighting for strangers locked inside the exact same kind of building. None of these people had access to the full truth the way we understand it today. What they consistently had instead was the willingness to look closely at a frightening problem, propose an imperfect answer anyway, and adjust course the moment better evidence finally arrived to correct them. That, I think, is the real thread running underneath everything we have covered together tonight. Progress rarely announces itself with a clean, obvious victory. It usually looks exactly like tonight's stories did, messy, contested, occasionally cruel in its side effects, built by ordinary, flawed, frightened people, doing their genuine best with whatever incomplete evidence happened to be sitting in front of them at the time. We are, whether we notice it or not, still living every single day inside decisions those same people made in sick rooms and courtrooms and cramped little laboratories more than 150 years ago. Thank you sincerely for spending this entire night here with me, walking through all 12 of these stories together from a single hospital corridor in Vienna all the way to a crowded streetcar platform in New York. If even one of these stories stayed with you, made you look at something ordinary a little differently, or simply helped you drift off feeling a little less alone in the dark, then this was exactly the kind of night I hoped to give you. If you enjoyed the time we spent together tonight, I would be truly grateful if you considered supporting this channel, whether that means subscribing, leaving a like, or simply sharing a comment about which story stayed with you longest. It honestly helps more than you might realize. Rest well tonight. Let your eyes grow heavy. Let the rest of the world go quiet for a while and know that there is another story waiting for you. The next time you need one another. Strange little corner of history worth sitting with quietly until you finally fall asleep.